this was the last post I'd written, 2015, obviously, December 31st, and it was kind of weird with the burning of Boleskine, but I quoted Liber AL.III, verse 34, obviously, too, which is related, relevant in a way. I saw it as related. And I said, on December 23rd, just over a week ago, thy house, 418, otherwise known as Boleskine, was reported as having burnt down at 1340. Multiple agencies reported, but I will link to the one in which I am reproducing a photo from here. While it is not apparent what may have caused the fire at this point from the articles, it is an obvious question if it were accident or arson. Either way, the event seems portentous because upon finding out about it, I thought about the invisible house mentioned in Liber AL, said to remain even though with fire and sword it be burnt down and shattered. This itself may even potentially be an MO for someone or some group, either to evoke a predictive response or to further the mystique through extreme measures of contrivance. Or perhaps it was an honest mistake or coincidence, or maybe if there is no such thing as the coinciding of events, then a chance occurrence, whichever terminology you prefer. I still find it odd that in this 111th year of Horus, which it was in 2015, in which I have been trying to bring in the Mayachian aspect of the double current, as promulgated by Freder Akkad and more thoroughly expressed by Kenneth Grant, most strongly that this verse becomes further manifested. This year has consisted of preliminary work to prepare not only myself, but all who have undertaken or partaken of this journey for further induction into the Mayachian tide of Ionic unfoldment. It has become apparent now with the fall of Boleskine as a token that the original spirit of Thelema has passed on to new and different streams of manifestation that no longer resemble what Crowley himself created or envisioned. While obviously his work is of great importance and value, it is also very important to remember not to be too dogmatic with his writings. In the case of modern Thelema-based groups in the Caliphate, so-called OTO, in particular, the situation has rendered these, for the most part, inert and ineffective, or in some cases, detrimental. For strict insistence on dogmatic adherence to word-for-word teachings, or whatever, behaviors, or from any one person is by its very nature anti-Thelemic. The work of Kenneth Grant, which has been strongly demonized and even subject to court proceedings to remove the OTO symbol from his writings, has noted this problem, as have numerous others. And of course, Kenneth Grant is, like I say that not to mention, or not to too strongly stick to one person's writings, but and then I go to Kenneth Grant, but obviously his writings imply so many other people and so many other books and documents. But so the irony is that since Kenneth Grant, not a single person from the Caliphate OTO or any Thelemic group has produced near the quality of work as Grant has, at least in my opinion. At least in terms of, like, again, bringing together so many threads and linking them and then evolving it in a sense, especially again with Freder Akkad, Nima, Michael Bertot, like just linking all that, I think gave a lot of impetus for many different things. So if they have, I have yet to come across it. No one else's work has provided near as clear an understanding into Crowley's work and the true precepts of Thelema. Although there could be, there's authors and artists who essentially could be doing their own work. It just is not tied to Crowley. As well as the underlying and inner meaning of the many facets of the subject. And it doesn't seem even the official inheritors wish to, at least not without milking the herd for what they can first. In my experience of going to the local OTO chapter, The leader himself appeared to be largely unfamiliar with the work of Grant himself, claiming his books to be too expensive, but apparently knew a little from what he might have gleaned from Wikipedia or somewhere else, like a convention or online or whatever. It's funny because this is an organization that costs quite a bit of money to become and be a member of. But I was 22 at the time, and even I had already obtained all of Grant's books and a whole occult library of my own, and that's at minimum wage. And I said, come on now, I mean, because I'm just like, it was just kind of a weird situation where I was like, okay, so there's a lot of information here, but no one seems to avail themselves to it. And that's why I saw it didn't seem like the so-called OTO truly represented the active current, I guess, so much as Grant and what he had spawned. I find this important since, upon being quizzed on some basic Crowleyan history and various Kabbalistic correspondences and concepts, all of which I was able to answer easily, I proceeded to quiz them and mention a few things I've learned, which led me to actually be rather disappointed in finding out they weren't as well-read or open-minded as I had expected. After having been acquainted with the work of G.M. Kelly, which itself is far from free of defect, it became a little more apparent as to why. One of my current magical co-workers also has experience with this disorder, and has related a number of incidences which only parallel many I have heard from others regarding the nature of the people occupying leadership roles, which is typical of any position involving supposed authority. Perhaps some people are into that sort of thing. The problem, however, is it becomes insidious and should be met with caution, or at least it can. There is nothing any group can give you that you cannot obtain on your own, and possibly, obviously better, especially when actual hard-earned money is involved. When you are giving money in return for anything, you should begin to question in what way you may be being vampirized. Though we all have to pay our dues in some form or fashion, we are always of free will to choose how we spend. Charity is a different story, but it will never translate as currency for debts. So the Horus Maat Lodge, which was founded by Nima and Ion, now appears to be defunct in the outer. As should be known, Nima and Ahadna is the magical name of Margaret Cook, or Maggie Ingalls, who channeled Liber Penumbra in December of 1974 and related it to Kenneth Grant, which led him to realize the importance of the later work of Frater Akkad, Crowley's magical son, because they both heavily focus on the Ma'at aspect and connected in numerous symbological and mathematical ways which seemed too apparent to dismiss, especially considering the fact that Akkad's later researches were unknown to Nima and unpublished until 2020. This order is based on self-initiation, and according to the HML Charter, the Horus Maat Lodge is a body invisible on the outer. It meets on varied planes and is not restricted by time or space. Thus, the invisible house has always and will always be here for those who can attain access. The work of the balancing of the energies of Horus with those of Ma'at are manifesting further. In this past year, which has been particularly a double current year, being that of 2015 and related to Atu 15, the double one has been especially productive in this regard. 2016 will be related to the Tower or War card and will signify destruction of the old to make way for the new. The great equinox is the great shift, not of seasons but of eons, and the fall of the great equinox is this year, 111 of Horus, wherein the balance between the dualities has been affected through this work, and needs to further crystallize in the outer. The formula of 666 has been justified and balanced with that of 999. The key of it all has been revealed, and the next order of business is to bring fresh fever from the skies. And so, I need to put a space there, but, 2015 was a weird year, and a lot happened. And that's when the next year, I started sort of started like putting a little more effort, I guess, into things. I saw that the data was starting to come alive in some weird way. So in the end of this post, I talk about Liber Mayan, which ended up being 999, and I wanted to have it somehow relate to 999. I didn't know that would end up being 999 with a none final, but it was, or it is. So I have had this thought about for the last few days, this division of 999 into 444, like 2 444s and 111, which again it referenced in that past post as, or 66 as 111. So the balance holding the 2 444s is significant. And I was reading the Eon Eye, like I just came across it because I remember M. Eon, or Alexander Rivera, posting videos like recently, and he posted about his new book, which I just actually ordered, and so I don't have anything to say about it yet, but it's supposed to be here like literally tomorrow. So I was reading this again, and he has all these posts, so I assume it'll be somewhere along these lines, but he even mentions this eclipse that had happened on August 21st, 2017. And so there's so much he's talking about here, because so much has happened since then. But all this symbolism is weird because I don't know. I literally did have this waking up experience of just knowing the mathematics of 444 divided by 444, like or just really 888 divided in 2, but somehow symbolizing the hurricane over water. And because I've been thinking about this hurricane idea for months now, well, really actually since 2019, and even I guess that I remember her, Tracy talking about Irminsul and all that, but I didn't really think much of it then. I mean, in some weird way, there was something about it. Like, I got what she was saying, like, there's something to this, but I didn't really know much. I didn't think much about it. But looking back, this whole 444 thing, what he ends up saying is, like, this bifurcation of time. In my book, The Sun Lady Unveiled, I mentioned the bifurcation of the timelines. And so 444 is this Ron Mallett number and all of his theories, but really so many things dealing with space and time and really the fourth dimension. And so this bifurcation is really weird and how this has fallen into place, and how he ends up mentioning 888 down, way down here. And so the 444 and 444. But yet, for whatever reason, people are unwilling to look into the Kabbalah too much, I guess. And then, 999 is held back, like people don't mention it. They hold back from getting to it for some reason. Even though it's mentioned, again, in Materials for the Apostolic, or Materials for the Study of the Apostolic Gnosis. And so I don't know if I should read this or just leave it and mention it later, because I think that it plays a role in what I want to actually read, which is I was going through different books and considering what I think I need to read that I haven't, and there's so much about, like, I tried talking about it to someone, which is Wilhelm Reich, and despite the fact, obviously he's got the ORGONE accumulators, or whatever they're called, cloudbusters, also, some of it, there's so much, I think, to his theories, but they were limited by him and his life and the time, and I think it's something worth going back and considering, as well as some of these other people and their ideas, but not necessarily sticking to them, like some people do. Like there's still orgone, and these little orgone what are they, like the made up resin things? I don't know what effect that would have. If anything, I'd think the resin would hold it back, but I don't know. I still think that the psychology, Freud himself, from what I know, because I've looked into his books a lot, and from what I get, there's a lot to go over and consider, and yet people just dismiss him based on this idea that, I don't know, these simplistic ideas. But yeah, the whole orgone concept, orgone, just essentially energy, however you want to consider it, but it's a particular, I don't know, it's a weird thing. It's weird. How do you talk about orgone? I think that it's more, again, about this underlying energy, and then his whole thing about character armoring and the character types. Man in the Trap, I've read that book, and that seemed really helpful to understand just what I think is worth going over, aside from the mechanical later on things that he tried to develop. But anyway, he's brought up in this book the cosmic pulse of life, which is about UFOs somewhat, but there's these chapters that mention the Kabbalah, and I've flipped through them, but I haven't read every little bit of them. And so, since I did find the 8th Tower in PDF. It's on PDF drive, even though I have the book, but just so it's easy to go over. There's so much in this that I think is, but it's hard to find because it's not. There's no index. You have to sit there and read it, chapter to chapter. There's footnotes, but it brings so much to focus, and I have all these other things pulled up, but it's just so I have to reference them. So cosmic electronics. There's 2 chapters I want to read of this. It is not an arbitrary decree of God, but in the nature of man, that a veil shuts down on the face of tomorrow. For the soul will not have us read any other cipher than that of cause and effect. Ralph Waldo Emerson. The basic discovery of radionic medicine and the radiant nature of living organisms made by Dr. Albert Abrams will probably be judged by 21st century science as epochal. The subject of continuous efforts at suppression in the U.S., these discoveries have nevertheless survived. Split into many different streams and modes of development, all of them thus far outside official scientific acceptance, they are nevertheless the beginning of the new cosmic electronics. The confusion that often exists within the radionic movement exemplifies the way in which the Ahrimanic powers, when all else fails, split and compartmentalize the new knowledge even as they have the old. Mechanistic science is a monument to this kind of splitting action, with its interdisciplinary barriers and multitudes of highly educated people barely able to comprehend one another's work. The reality of this splitting and fragmentation of new discoveries that are cosmically significant is demonstrated in the case of Sigmund Freud's work. Working a little before Abrams' time, the master of psychoanalysis was in no doubt that his discoveries would eventually open a pathway from psychology to biology. This was yet another possibility for microcosmic, macrocosmic relationships to come into modern human ken. Half a dozen of Freud's followers, who thought they were both smart and right, splintered Freud's work. All became famous and respected. None found the psychology to biology pathway. That achievement belongs to Dr. Wilhelm Reich, who maintained his direction on the pathway broken by Freud, his mentor. Similar circumstances and a similar fate attended Goethe's major impulses to scientific cognition at the inception of the age of modern material science. This has been dealt with already in our review of Steiner's work. Goethean concepts lead to a spiritual dynamic understanding of natural processes. Following Goethe's methods of training, observation and thought would have obviated for mankind the Ahrimanic fragmentation of knowledge that ensued from the mechanistic, lifeless world conception that was impressed on mankind instead. These examples are cited to illustrate how the right way, even when found, can be quickly obscured and lost again through Ahrimanic influences on vulnerable humans. Vulnerability is rooted in spiritual ignorance. As long as humanity remains ignorant of the existence and workings of the Ahrimanic powers, as detailed in Chapter 13, The Boys Downstairs, these influences will be felt and wielded in evolution. Negative superstition sustains these processes, and its major instrumentality is academia. What we have here to relate concerning these new discoveries is that instruments and concepts have been poorly received by academia. Ask yourself why this is. When the same segment of society can devote a disproportionate percentage of its energies to fashioning devices of destruction, your answer lies in Ahrimanic inspiration and control, the control of good men by unseen degenerates. If you have ever wallowed in the philosophic bog, separating human knowing from human doing, knowledge of the beings from beneath man brings you to firm ground. Life can be read with accuracy. In the case of the Abrams work, there was one individual who followed the initial breakthrough and in due course found the cosmic mainstream. That individual was Dr. Ruth B. Drown. Her achievements do not diminish those of others who devotedly pursued the Abrams discoveries in their own way. Not one of them, however, was able to make the monumental cosmic connections that Ruth Drown established. Her cross-sectional full-plate photographs of human histological and pathological structures are to this day unequaled. These photographs are staggering verification of the technology from which they are derived. Almost everyone involved in the radionic field became a party to the general process of sequestration where these photographs were concerned. Sequestration is the process of walling off a discovery by not looking at it or into it, and by verbalizing it away when it arises to consideration through its own native buoyancy. In extreme cases, as with Wilhelm Reich, the scientific literature that would guide men to these principles is burned in full legality. Official science tacitly assents to the destruction of such literature. Where the cosmic connections become too obvious, too strong, and too undeniable, the innovator is legally murdered. The 20th century has done no better than any other in promoting truth, but it exceeds all others in its promotion of murder. Our description of the basic instrument of cosmic electronics will begin with the Drown experiment having 9 dials. Her initial instrument had 7 dials, but the reason for extension to 9 dials will become evident shortly. Instruments in this 9-dialed configuration were being used and made by Dr. Drown up until her death. In all the world of electronics, there is no piece of apparatus seemingly simpler than a Drown tuner. Each of the 9 dials has 10 positions numbered from 1 to 10. Behind each position is a metal stud leading to the back of the panel. At the back of the panel, a simple loop of wire passes around each stud on the way to the next stud, or on its way to the next stud. These 9 10-position dials, with a single loop of wire around each dial position behind the panel, are led out at one end to 2 metal plates. At the other end, the dials are connected via the rubber detecting pad to ground. In a diagnostic setup, the patient sits with his feet on the footplates. The patient is the source of the bioenergetic signals originating in his tissues, that are to be tuned by the instrument. In non-medical applications, any specimen may be placed on the footplates and tuned by the instrument. The principles of analogy will have value here in clarifying the function of the drone instrument. The analogy is with radio broadcasting, but it should be constantly borne in mind that with a drone instrument, we deal with life energy and not electricity. The sketch sharpens the analogy. So I already am thinking of the, I forgot what it's called, but the theta meter or whatever from Scientology, which obviously I don't necessarily, like, it's not like a belief, or it's not like I believe in it. There may be some sort of magnetic process to it, or who knows what, but I don't know. Like, I think that the life energy they're talking about, the algorithms of like the mind and the just all the vital signs that could be ascertained with biometrics and possibly nanotechnology if you needed, or just certain fields. When certain technologies would be developed, then this stuff would all just be, again, like a prototype of an idea of that, I guess. But all radio and older TV receivers have an antenna with which they pick up the vibrations transmitted through the ether by the various, or medium, I guess, atmosphere or whatever, by the various broadcasting stations. The antenna collects these vibrations, leads them into the radio set, and there they are tuned, resisted, amplified, and finally made audible and visible in TV by the processes in the receiver. The drone instrument similarly begins with an antenna or aerial. The patient is the broadcasting service, emitting a jumble of different bioenergetic vibrations. So wait. So patient is 555. Pei, Aleph, Tau, Yod, He, Nun, Teth. And so I was thinking about how 555 is this backdoor. I mean, it's the central chamber, but it's also that non-existent phone number in movies and whatnot. 555-2368, and 2368 is Jesus Christ. But so in phantoms, computational human phantoms. Phantoms is 555. The patient is the broadcasting source emitting a jumble of different bioenergetic vibrations. This vibratory activity is conducted to the tuning section of the drone instrument, which is simply an antenna that may be tuned to bioenergetic vibratory activity. The patient sits with his feet on the end of an antenna. The antenna collects his broadcast, the totality of all the emanations from his body tissues and organs. From this totality, the various transmissions from heart, lungs, liver, and other individualized structures are separated by a tuning process. These transmissions are then compared with what are known to be the normal transmissions from healthy organs and tissues. The vibratory rate or frequency of any organ or other bodily structure is established by the molecular arrangement of material substance from which the organ is formed, and the vibratory rate is expressed numerically. The rate of liver tissue, for example, is always the same throughout the human and animal kingdoms. This rate does not change unless disease or malfunction cause changes in the molecular structure of the organ. All diseases similarly have their own distinctive vibratory rates, and may be thereby identified. Years of cautious labor were needed to establish these rates, as they are called in drone therapy. And so, rates being like going around in a circle reminds me of 666. As they are, so they equate, for analogy, with the frequencies assigned to radio stations by the federal government. Tissue rates, by contrast, are assigned by the cosmos. The rate of tissue in drown therapy is established by placing a healthy specimen on the footplates and then tuning in on the molecular broadcast. The broadcast is broken down in the tuning process into its component vibrations in general accord with Fourier's theorem. This process is termed establishing a rate. An example would be the tissue supporting the human kidneys, which has a rate of 379. Healthy tissue of this type always has this rate and no other. Drown diagnosis is entirely numerical in character, and is more firmly anchored in mathematics than any conventional approach to diagnosis. The drown system, by virtue of this mathematical basis, has an inherent affinity for truth consistent with all other mathematical processes at human disposal. All drown diagnosis, therapy, and radiovision photography depends upon the use of numbers. Significantly enough, the chemical ether, which we identified in Chapter 11, Cosmic Blueprint, as the correct occult name for the orgone energy, is also known to occultists as the number ether. The vibratory rate of anything in creation may be established by this process. Application of the instrument is not confined to human structures or to diagnostic processes. Any element, compound, or mixture may be examined in this way and its rate established. There are multitudes of resonances between the human body and other kingdoms of nature, and the ancient art of gems is one small example of how men of old perceived and often prized stones and other substances sympathetically resonant to various parts of the body, and the emotions irradiating those parts. An ordinary photograph of an artifact of any kind can be placed on the footplates and a vibratory rate established. A photo reproduces form, and form is produced by molecular arrangements. In the UFO field, much has been learned through this particular application of the drown work, and it will be dealt with fully in its place. Human beings today can literally tune in on UFOs of all types. So that's funny. It's types. It's like taxonomy and taxia. So by these methods and personal experience taught me that this is the way that certain unseen entities of advanced mentality also can and do tune in on humans. When a rate is established, it is entered in an atlas and becomes a formal part of the technique. All bodily organs, glands, tissues, and fluids, as well as all common diseases, have their rates listed in the atlas. Anything that can be placed upon the input plates of the instrument can be expressed numerically in this way. The number is derived from the emanations originating in the substance and immediately related to its form. The vibratory rates of known elements, such as iron, copper, tin, and so on, are numerically consistent with the known atomic weight of those elements. The atomic weight of an element is the experimentally determined number of electrons in the orbital system of that element. The atomic weight is not an arbitrary number, and the mathematical correspondence between the drown vibratory rate and the atomic weight should give firm indication that the drown rates are not arbitrary numbers, but rather cosmic numbers. This simple yet complex tunable antenna, by virtue of having 9 dials, each with 10 positions, will tune to over 2 billion different combinations. Behind each dial division, inside the cabinet, is a small length of wire or stub. Each stub is loop connected to the following stub, and each 10-position dial is connected in series to the next. From a formal point of view, the arrangement could be considered a type of impedance rheostat, but gross errors result if we seek to establish too close a relationship with existing electrical concepts. A drown instrument has a direct current resistance of 1 ohm. Each stud being numbered, the vibrations detected are expressed numerically, as they are extracted one at a time from the totality of any vibration passing through the instrument. The operator strokes a rubber diaphragm placed over the upper plate of the signal recording condenser, When the tuner comes into resonance with any component of the incoming vibrations, the friction of the operator's hand upon the rubber diaphragm grounds these charges. The effect is felt as a definite stickiness of the hand on the rubber pad, and heard as a sharp snapping sound. In the case of the radio receiver, the carrier wave of the station being tuned strikes the antenna. On the carrier, the broadcasting station has superimposed the announcer's voice or music. Whatever its nature, the superimposed element of the signal is called the modulation. The radio receiver picks up the carrier wave, extracts and amplifies the modulation from the carrier, and reproduces it through a loudspeaker. In our analogy, the electrostatic energy of the human body, which remains with it after death, is the carrier wave in the drowned conception of these processes. The vital energy, orgone, of the human being, which flows into and through and animates the human tissues, is the modulation or intelligence. This energy is not present in the body after death. Absence of this energy turns a living human into a corpse. This vital or orgone energy enables our organs and tissues to maintain their form. The drown instrument tunes into the histological structure to determine whether or not the carrier in the various organs and glands is receiving the proper amount of intelligence or modulation, i.e. life energy. In the drown instrument, the longest of the 9 antenna connections is coupled to the first dial. The base rates of vibration it is intended to detect are usually set up in the human structure by some lowering or impingement of function. In simple terms, if any organ is so afflicted that the passage of vital energy through it is impeded, then a low vibration will be set up that can be detected on the disease dial. Acupuncture on the contemporary scene lends additional force to the concept of energy impingement in radionic medicine. The chi, or vital force, of acupuncture is functionally identical to the orgone energy of Wilhelm Reich. In its own right, acupuncture is a valid alternative to modern official medicine with its self-defeating dependence upon synthetic chemicals and total incomprehension of the life energy. As the disease dial is rotated from stud to stud, the diagnostician strokes the detecting pad. When the disease dial is turned on to the stud that matches the length of the antenna to the disease vibration coming from the patient, the diagnostician's finger sticks on the pad and makes a snapping sound. Visual indicators using a cathode ray tube were built and used by Dr. Drown. The arrangement proved less desirable and efficient for the expert operator than the tactile oral detector, and was in time discarded. No energy enters the instrument in diagnosis except that of the patient. The instrument itself is connected to the ground. Inside the cabinet are no electron tubes, pilot lights, transistors, batteries, or connections to the commercial power. Just 9 circles of loop-connected studs confront the investigator. The sheer simplicity of construction and appearance led to the automatic condemnation of the whole thing as quackery. The Ahrimanic powers, whose votaries control human science, have good reasons for wanting to wipe this allegedly quack instrument off the face of the earth. Those 9 dials and what they connect to and represent and manipulate are the break-in to cosmic electronics. That is why in Dr. Drown's entire career, not one representative of official medicine, not one court or law officer, not one physicist investigating the work for the law or the universities, not one district attorney planning to frame her, ever went to her and asked how the instrument was supposed to work. Their high academic qualifications led them to think that they already knew. They knew nothing about the instrument whatever and were determined not to find out. The cosmic connections of those 9 seemingly innocuous rings of loops would have been beyond their comprehension. Those connections have awaited the attention of a younger, better, more life-positive generation that wants its mind blown and its creative imagination fired. Those young people are on the earth now and they mean business. Cosmic electronics is for them. In the diagnostic process, as developed by Dr. Drown, the function of every organ and gland was systematically measured. A blood chemistry, a differential blood count, and urinalysis were all made in the body, and the accuracy of these tests was repeatedly established by comparison with regular laboratory results. The first cause of the patient's illness was established by these systematic tunings, and the result was a complete dynamic blueprint of the individual being examined. Many years of careful work were necessary to bring radionic diagnosis to the level of efficiency that she reached. A cross-sectional radiovision photograph could be made of any part of the patient's body if necessary or desirable. Since subsequent non-medical researches with orgone energy by myself, using variants of Dr. Wilhelm Reich's cloudbuster, have revealed an intimate nature between orgone energy and terrestrial magnetism, and DVD and videotape recording has a thundering future in the new medicine. The probability is high that with minimum work, the cross-sectional photographs made by Dr. Drown and her co-workers during her lifetime could be produced in the near future as motion pictures. There can be no doubt that it is possible to go inside a diseased organ and objectify it on a TV screen as it functions in the living human. All this without the need for an incision or any of the magnets or mechanism essential to CAT scans. In therapy, the patient is placed in a complete circuit with himself. His energy is collected on a plate of block tin placed over the solar plexus. This energy is passed through the instrument and back to the patient via his feet, the latter resting on 2 plates of German silver. The minute electrical current resulting from the junction via the patient's body of the dissimilar metals of tin and German silver acts in the therapy hookup as a carrier for the vital energy. The patient's energy normally would be radiated into the ethers to return to him after a world circling journey. Under this therapeutic system, the energy is passed through the instrument instead. The tuning of the device governs the precise area of the body into which the totality of the patient's energy returns. The focusing of his total energy in this way results in increased cell division in the tissue so treated. New cells come in healthy and the diseased condition is gradually overcome. Over a period and with systematic and careful monitoring by the doctor, the affected organ or tissue is largely restored. Never should it be forgotten that the energy involved in therapy is possessed inherently of form-giving power. As regeneration begins, the vibratory rate of the area under treatment begins changing back to a normal, healthy rate of vibration. Regular checking by the doctor is necessary to keep the instrument in tune with the tissue under treatment. Many thousands of persons through the years have been able to feel directly the focusing of their energy by these methods. Similarly felt at sites far remote from the physician's office is the changing of rate patterns when the physician makes adjustments. This brings us to the special properties of blood in this new medicine. Early in the history of the Abrams work, it was found that a patient's blood sample was equivalent, in a bioenergetic tuning sense, to having the patient present. A patient could be treated via his blood sample. Later on, experience established that a single dime-sized spot of a patient's blood, held in crystalline form in a chip of blotting paper, permitted the diagnostician to tune in on the patient regardless of the patient's physical location in the world. Physical separation from diagnostician and patient was of no consequence, for when he was tuned in on, he was bioenergetically present at the input to the instrument. This bore unequivocal testimony to the existence of a unifying bioenergetic continuum. The etheric web of ancient occultism had become a modern scientific reality. Dr. Drown extended this finding technologically. She made complete diagnoses, including all blood and urine tests, provided therapy, and also made cross-sectional tissue photographs. From Europe in 1939, she made an unequivocal radiovision photograph of a stomach cancer in a Connecticut patient, confirmed by post-mortem surgery conducted by the patient's own doctor, a qualified osteopathic physician and surgeon. Dr. Drown herself had patients in Europe treated from California until her death. The blood crystal was the visible end of an invisible line connecting crystal and patient for life, and for a short time after death. Rutted down as they are in the old knowledge, it is difficult for mechanistic scientists to conceive of such relationships as being valid. Their skepticism is usually rooted in their peculiar tunnel vision about cosmic laws and canons, and accentuated by their lack of investigation of the new knowledge. That a single drop of blood is indeed the bearer of these energy patterns is verified by European scientists following Dr. Rudolf Steiner's indications. This work was done independently of Americans pioneering in the new medicine, but has been subject to the same sequestration and obscurantism that has attended the birth of the new knowledge in the New World. Physicians, scientists, and all others interested in this pattern-bearing power of a single drop of blood should read two overwhelming books. They are Sensitive Crystallization Processes, a Demonstration of Formative Forces in the Blood by Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, 1931, republished 1975, and Formative Processes in Crystallization by Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, published in the Anthroposophic Press, 1936. These books outline and describe the experimental methods by which a single drop of blood subject to sensitive crystallization processes demonstrably contains the pattern forms of various diseases. These disease forms or signatures are distributed according to definite law within the crystallization field. These crystallizations enable the physician to diagnose the patient's ailments by studying these blood crystallizations. The work has been clinically verified by qualified physicians in Europe over a period of many years and is still in use there. The pattern-bearing power of a single drop of human blood is a demonstrated scientific fact, and the so-called skeptic should inform himself concerning this process. Throughout her life, Ruth Drown talked in a reverent awe of the Creator's works. She was as close to being a holy woman as anyone could come and still remain human. Accordingly, she considered herself a trustee of the work she initiated and took a very high level rather than its inventor or creator. She would quickly correct anyone claiming she was the originator of the work and never ceased asking in her daily devotions for guidance. In the early days, she particularly asked for guidance regarding the true meaning of those 9 circles made up of chains of loops. These requests were in due course answered. In 1930, a friend gave Dr. Drown a copy of MacGregor Mather's book, The Kabbalah Unveiled. One of the major classics of Kabbalistic literature, it was for years the handbook of Med Lane, whose early theoretic penetration of the UFO mystery has already been described. At the time Ruth Drown was given this book, she had been a student of metaphysics for some 14 years. Despite this background, she was overwhelmed by the mighty classic. Mather's was in the stratosphere of extended thought. In the ensuing few years, Dr. Drown kept digging into Mather's book, seemingly without making much progress. The volume nevertheless exerted upon her continuous attraction. During this period, Drown therapy was in its infancy. Rates for various bodily organs and diseases were still being worked out, and a corpus of diagnostic knowledge slowly acquired. Thousands of painstaking hours were involved in the birth of the new medicine. The 9-dialed instrument came into being as the first advance within Drown therapy itself. Behind all this devoted labor there loomed in the mind of the woman whose responsibility it had become the Kabbalah Unveiled. With its ramified cosmic mathematics, glyphs, and charts, the book became something much more. It became a presence. The Kabbalah is the esoteric tradition of Israel. This refers not to the contemporary Mediterranean state, but to the ancient Hebrew culture in which European spiritual culture has its roots. The Kabbalah is an esoteric tradition that may be traced back to the star worshippers of Chaldea, Those ancient humans who, by virtue of their different mode of consciousness, understood cosmic workings far more deeply than does contemporary science with its mechanistic superficialities. Many of us today are those men and women of old, reincarnated repeatedly since, and with all this knowledge a part of our subconscious content. A contemporary task is to get it all up into modern consciousness and see to its rebirth in modern technical terms. The Kabbalah has been derided as a collection of medieval forgeries, berated as rabbinical law, and variously characterized as fraud, falsehood, and fiddle-faddle. These epithets fall readily from enemies of truth. Theocrats often drove the Kabbalah underground. Modern scientists would call it mysticism or myth and say no more. In its various forms, nevertheless, the Kabbalah has come to modern man as a living system of esoteric science, appropriate to the use of both artistic and technical consciousness. Instruments for its objective study and technological employment are already on the earth, rifling the whole thing into the technical times in which we live. All theologies have a secret tradition or Kabbalah of their own. This secret tradition may consist of only those principles imparted to priests and ministers and withheld from congregations. No religion is without such a Kabbalah. The chosen people of the Kabbalah today are chosen after the Spirit and not after the flesh or by race. The chosen people are those who, in this cosmic age of earth, feel a willingness to approach things behind the manifested world. Their common problem is finding the necessary methods for such an approach. There are millions of such people on the earth today, and millions more are coming. The younger generation of the 1960s, many by the false path of chemical illumination, caught a glimpse of these deeper realities. Many who survived the chemical binge of the 60s pursue the new knowledge now by healthier pathways, and their convictions of the rottenness of the old order remain. Those who maintain the thrust of their search will not be disappointed in their spiritual aspirations. Only by genuine spiritual renewal can human life be significantly changed. In this sketch of the Kabbalah and its relationship to the work of Dr. Drown, we can once again deal only with its bare bones, the same presumption to which we were forced with Dr. Steiner's work. Accordingly, we deal primarily with those aspects of the Drown work that bear upon the UFO mystery. Beyond this sketch, there lies a fascinating lifetime of work and personal discovery for every awakened person drawn to this new knowledge. Bridges have been fashioned, theoretically and physically, in terms of apparatus, connecting the physical material world to those other orders of being and substance that have begun to impinge increasingly upon earth life. The key to the Kabbalah is the formulation of a concrete symbol to represent the abstract, a glyph or composite symbol. In Kabbalism, the main glyph is the Tree of Life. This beautiful glyph, which is reproduced herein, is helm, compass, and chart to the Kabbalist as he embarks with his thinking into the invisible that stands behind the visible world. The Tree of Life is the slide rule of the mind. Operate it correctly and the most involved problems become comprehensible. Embodied in the Tree of Life, awaiting the penetration of the user, lie all the connections between man and the universe. Each of the symbols on the Tree of Life represents some cosmic force or factor, and the connections that force or factor has with the cosmos. The 10 Sephiroth represent planes or levels of manifestation. They are not physical locations in the universe. In their descent from Sephirah 1 to Sephirah 10, they represent the descent of power to Malkuth, the physical plane, from all that lies above the physical plane. The significance of the 9 dials on the Drown instrument should already be dawningly evident. As the 10 Sephiroth represent manifestation, that from which they came is termed the Great Unmanifest, the chaos of the ancients. In Kabbalism, the Great Unmanifest is also termed the Negative Limitless Light. Kher is the starting point of creation, the crown of creation. Kher in Hebrew meaning crown. Kher, some people pronounce Keter, is the first stirrings from the great unmanifest in the highest reach of finite human consciousness. Beyond Kher, the Kabbalist draws the veil. In a brief review of this type, we can say nothing comprehensible whatever concerning it to the newcomer. The Mystical Kabbalah by Dion Fortune is a suitable reference text and one that Dr. Drown recommended. Kher contains within itself all the other Sephiroth. These Sephiroth, evolving from one another, finally descend to Malkuth, the physical material world as we perceive it with our unaided senses. Each Sephira contains within it all that follows after it. The alert reader will immediately discern the factual and conceptual correspondence with Etherian physics as outlined in Chapter 11, Cosmic Blueprint. Chokmah, for example, which is the, Chokmah, which is the second Sephira, contains within itself all that follows on the descent of power, 8 potencies or densities in all. The paths between the Sephiroth show additional connections and relationships. Will and power, electric. Love and wisdom, magnetic. Active intelligence, Saturn, indigo. Harmony, Jupiter, blue. Science, Mars, red. Sun, yellow, intuition. Higher mind, cause and effect, thought, spirit. Desire, Venus, emerald green. Reason, Mercury, orange. So lower mind, moon, purple, propagation. And elements, earth, citrus, olive green, magenta, and black. The basic Kabbalistic relationships utilized in diagnostic, therapeutic, and photographic work of Dr. Ruth B. Drown. Kher may be likened to the first bowl in a waterfall consisting of a chain of bowls. When it fills, it flows over into Chokmah below it. Chokmah fills and flows over into Bina, and so on down. Instead of water, think now of diminishing levels of density. If you want a cosmically valid concept of God, think that God is pressure, the pressure that keeps all bowls full. Ufologists who maintain an ostrich posture over the hostility of certain UFO entities should grasp one central principle of Kabbalism. There is no manifestation without differentiation into pairs of opposites. Kher differentiates into Chokmah and Bina, male and female potencies respectively, with Chokmah representing force and Bina representing form. Force and form are the two indispensable factors in manifestation. Numbers are assigned to each Sephira. Kher is assigned number 1. Chokmah and Bina are respectively assigned 2 and 3. On the left-hand pillar of the Tree of Life, known as the Form Pillar and also as the Pillar of Severity, are found Jebera 5 and Hod 8. The right-hand pillar, known as the Force Pillar, includes Chesed 4 and Netzach 7. Between these two pillars is the central pillar of equilibrium or mildness. This is the Kabbalistic location of the Christ principle, known also to the Buddhists as the golden mean between the extremes of force and form. The Sephira 6, in its location on the Tree of Life, graphically and accurately depicts the central role of the Christ principle in Earth evolution. The balanced nature of the Tree of Life illustrates the harmony of cosmic organization. The descent of power follows the numbers from Kher to Malkuth, proceeding across the tree and down, just like a lightning flash. Illumination or cosmic consciousness, which may be broadly defined as instant understanding of the whole cosmic fabric, proceeds upwards from Malkuth in the same zigzag fashion. The lightning flash, often used in electrical motifs, has its origin in this process of illumination. The numbers assigned since antiquity to the various Sephiroth happen also to correspond precisely with the numbers assigned to the tuning dials on the Drown instruments. The sheer volume of these correspondences, all of them developed from years of clinical research with the instruments and objectified in radiovision photographs, excludes any possibility of accident or coincidence. From the inception of her work, Dr. Drown's instruments were the 20th century concretion of the Kabbalah. A few of these correspondences can now be discussed, with special emphasis upon the way the basic findings of drone therapy bear upon the UFO problem. We shall find our way by this means to the communication methods that are at the disposal of advanced intelligences currently interested in Earth evolution, be those intelligences from above or beneath man. So the note says, there is little doubt in the mind of any experimenter like myself who has dealt with both the orgone energy and electromagnetic energy that standard radio signals are carried by the etheric continuum as man-made artificial perturbations. With a drone instrument, by contrast, we deal with the native natural primary perturbations of the orgone continuum. Science invented its concept of the ether in distinction from the ethers identified by Rudolf Steiner, because there could not be electromagnetic waves without something for them to wave in. So while I think Ruth drowned, she's kind of, you can read her court proceedings and the different accusations they've made against her, but I still think that it's worth considering this idea, at least as a prototype for the whole idea of measuring and calibrating and then rectifying health problems, like through the blueprints of trying to figure out what's going on, which now we have better devices with, you know, fMRI and EEG, EKG, etc. But it's an interesting prototype of an idea, I guess. And of course they tried to shut her down, you know, but same with Wilhelm Reich, which I skipped over the other chapter. It speaks for itself. It's interesting. But what he says about Wilhelm Reich and further on is a little more interesting. And of course the whole Radionic force, I guess, supposedly, that he attributes to Ruth's demise and just the setback, as well as Wilhelm Reich, which I don't know if it's necessarily the Radionic current, but I can see what they were seeing as that and what is now manifested since then and where it's all going. The armoring definitely has what Wilhelm Reich calls armoring relates to that, and I don't know, just Ruth Drown's mechanical device. It makes me think of Thantafexith, or at least the sigil for it, the Qlipha of Tau, and the mechanical devices subsequently, you know, made since just all of it. It's kind of symbolic, I think. But Wilhelm Reich says, "We must begin with ourselves," by Ruth Drown. Craven crying after scientific heroes who will say that flying saucers are real has been a feature of establishment ufology for more than 60 years. Even statements inferential in this sense, if uttered by prominent scientists, have been repeated endlessly through the decades. Always the hope has been held out that a top scientific name would drop a blockbusting statement on UFOs, but it never happened. The only internationally renowned scientist to have had open contact with UFOs as a direct result of his scientific work, to have applied his talents, discoveries, research, and a major new invention to the problem, reporting all this fully in writing, was the late Dr. Wilhelm Reich. His findings on UFOs are the boldest and most urgent yet to emanate from any man of science. Establishment ufology has nevertheless ignored Reich. He will be dealt with here fully, truthfully, and accurately, and by one who has both built and applied Dr. Reich's inventions to the UFO problem, and who offers herewith objective evidence of their relevance and potency. Dr. Reich was a controversial figure throughout most of his professional life. Enemies of truth were relieved when he left the earth, thinking that his ideas and discoveries would die with him. The controversies that swirled around him while he was alive are but mere will-o-wahs compared with the mind-blowing typhoons that are to come. The orgone energy that he discovered and whose basic determinism he established is the prime mover and power source for the ubiquitous, elusive UFOs, be they creatures or craft. The formidable body of new knowledge brought into human ken by Dr. Wilhelm Reich was linked to my UFO research by two of Reich's closest professional coworkers. His daughter Eva, herself a medical doctor, made a connection with me through Dr. Drown. Biologist Robert McCulloch saw a functional identity between some of the photographs used to illustrate They Live in the Sky and similar aeroforms whose appearance in the Arizona skies was provoked by the use of Reich's cloudbuster. Field assistant to Dr. Reich in weather control, Bob McCulloch, reached me through the Borderland Science Research Foundation. Contact with these two people I count among my greatest blessings. Professional aids to Dr. Reich, their knowledge of his work and discoveries was deep and solid. By this means I was able to cut through the miasma of falsehood and misrepresentation that has been woven around Reich's work by numerous foes of truth. When Dr. Drown died, a parallel path to the one she had blazed was thus already open to me, thanks to Eva Reich and Bob McCulloch. Bringing Drown and Reich together seemed to me an obvious task, and within a few years I was tuning Reich's cloudbusters with Drown's instruments to photograph UFOs. Perhaps it was all an accident, as anxiety-ridden mechanists might assert, terrified of finding a grander design. Dr. Eva Reich was briefly a patient of Dr. Drown, suffering from an integral hemorrhage that conventional methods had failed to arrest. Eva had sought the aid of Dr. Drown without the necessity of having Eva come to California. Dr. Drown stopped the hemorrhage promptly from 3,000 miles away, utilizing her technique of grounding the parathyroid glands through the instrument using Eva Reich's blood crystal. Such things were routine to Dr. Drown. Dr. Eva Reich is an intelligent, perceptive woman of original mind. She saw connections immediately between the work of Dr. Drown and that of her father. She also quickly linked up my work on UFOs, to which she was introduced by Dr. Drown, with her father's contacts with space and with his far-reaching theories and findings concerning UFOs. In a lively correspondence, she led me step by step into orgonomy. She loaned me the foundational books of Reich's work in the proper sequence, so that I felt as though I were standing at Dr. Reich's elbow. After my own grim times and previously untrodden fields of work, I appreciated fully the decades of patient work that went into the discovery of the orgone energy and its consolidation. Without Eva Reich's thoughtful insistence that I begin at the beginning with Wilhelm Reich and her provision of the literature, my approach to orgonomy may well have been tangential and glancing. Many persons have failed to understand Reich's work for this very reason. Dr. Reich's unique scientific accomplishments can only be fully grasped if one begins with his Function of the Orgasm, Orgonomy's basic book. Bob McCulloch is a biologist in the broadest and best meaning of the term. With a master's degree from the Utah State Agricultural College, he was working as a research associate at the University of New Hampshire's Engineering Experiment Station in Durham, after hearing as early as 1946 about the exciting new biological research being done by Dr. Wilhelm Reich. In June of 1953, he became a research associate at the Oregon Institute Research Laboratories in Rangeley, Maine. He spent 2 exciting and unforgettable years in varied scientific and administrative work with Dr. Reich. Anyone who doubts that the cloudbuster manipulates orgone energy should look at Robert McCulloch. He will find its signature stamped forever on the organism of this big and powerful man. Bob got a jolt from the device in Arizona that paralyzed his right side, and to this day he still drags his right foot from that dramatic incident. When he originally wrote to me to tell me that the cloudbuster in Arizona had brought UFOs like those in my photographs into manifestation, he really started something. Close friends ever since, we are associated today in the commercial application of orgone energy weather engineering. Study of Dr. Steiner's work, the quiet teaching of Franklin Thomas, and my working friendship with Dr. Drown had all combined with my own fieldwork and experience to functionalize my thinking before I got into Reich's work. My mental concrete had already been shattered. Reich's findings and observations, instead of being a strain to follow and tolerate, as they so often are to conventionally trained students, became to me a flowing delight. Here were new channels for my own Mercury. Had it not been for Thomas, Steiner, and Drown, and the particular sequential manner in which they had influenced me, I would not have been able to carry the discovery of the orgone energy into ufology. Recognizing this, I have sought to lead the reader along the same pathway. This is bound to convey more of the core facts and processes than technical presentations devoid of any human context. Dr. Reich's work will be more easily comprehended in this way than if split off from the connection to an immense esoteric storehouse. Reich's discoveries lend a heretofore inaccessible practical dimension to the esoteric treasures of mankind. As with Dr. Steiner and Dr. Drown, there is an acknowledged presumption on my part in attempting to outline in a few thousand words the monumental work of Wilhelm Reich. An adequate biography of Dr. Reich lies far in the future because almost everything he achieved stands outside the framework of the old knowledge. His discoveries evoke a neurotic queasiness among the mandarins of mechanistic science. To admit validity of his major discovery is to admit simultaneously that numberless thousands of physicists have obtained scientific credentials on the basis of laws that are now demonstrably false. Few there be with such courage. A number of highly qualified men have admitted as much personally to me. Reich brought the orgone energy to human experience as a new force in nature. He also brought certain death to the older. He laid the bedrock of practical Etherian physics in the new technology. His cloudbuster invention, many of which I have built, designed, and used, is a crushing response to skeptics. Build one big enough and you can turn the Earth onto new alignments. I know the catastrophic consequences of the misuse of this force from engineering work with units of extremely modest size. This brief treatment of Reich's work will be directed mainly to the vast contribution he made to the solution of the UFO mystery. This brief treatment of Reich's work will be directed mainly to the vast contribution he made to the solution of the UFO mystery. Nobody on this earth will understand UFOs in a technical sense unless they first master Dr. Reich's discovery of the orgone energy. Lacking knowledge of the energy itself and the functional mode of thought that comes from its understanding, human beings can only stumble and grope as they try to penetrate the mystery with the old mechanistic knowledge. The manifold and multiform UFO phenomena are essentially orgonotic, and therefore beyond mechanistic reach. The humiliating impasse in which official science finds itself over UFOs stems from the non-existence within its rubric of the knowledge essential to a fruitful assault on the problem. Existing scientific reception systems continue to block this knowledge. This blocking is in turn a social objectification of neurotic blocking in individual humans. Neurotic resistance of the individual to radical discoveries in living functioning is reproduced on an institutional scale in organizations, such individuals, and soul. Reich elucidates this problem. Ufology has given abundant proof of its existence in the way UFO reports are handled. Recognizing on the basis of his brilliant career in the behavioral sciences that neurotic and irrational individuals, in or out of science, could only react by wanting to kill his life-giving discoveries, Dr. Reich originated the independent scientific discipline known as orgonomy. By this means, he published all his findings in bulletins, journals, and books for other scientists to test and replicate. He laid the foundations in psychology, biology, mathematics, physics, meteorology, sociology, astronomy, and astrophysics for a viable new technology, life-positive and life-giving. He wrote 20 books and untold scores of articles. He left behind 100,000 pages of unpublished manuscript, enough material for 100 more massive books. By 21st century science, he will be accounted the greatest natural scientist of this century, and one of the greatest men of all time. Let us now trace his steps and remember him accurately into the mores and forces that ruled his age. We will learn a great deal about UFOs by seeking to reconcile the magnitude of his achievements and benefactions with his death in a U.S. federal prison. Wilhelm Reich was born on a 1,000-acre farm in Austro-Hungary in 1897. Educated by a private tutor, his early years centered on the farm. Life, growth, and the husbanding of the living thus lay at the core of his being. Reproductive processes, to the human understanding of which he would contribute so massively, were constantly before him throughout his childhood and youth. He was an infant who looked directly at sexual processes cleanly and clearly. Interested and concerned with the practical study of living things, he studied plant and insect life and carried those studies on through to numerous animals on the farm. Throughout his life, he maintained an abiding trust in the integrity of farmers. By the time he was 17, both his parents were dead, and he ran the farm himself while continuing his education. Invading Russian troops destroyed the Reich farm in 1915. Stripped of his home and livelihood, he joined the Austrian army. He served on the Italian front as a lieutenant until war's end. His youthful interest in living things further manifested in a desire to make medicine his career. He entered the University of Vienna in 1918. A gifted teacher, he utilized his talent during his university days to support himself. He tutored other students, organized a sexology seminary, and inevitably became interested in the work of Dr. Sigmund Freud, then centered in Vienna. Reich became a member of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, a practicing psychoanalyst in 1920, and Freud himself predicted a brilliant career for the former young farmer. Graduating in medicine in 1922, Reich was chosen by Freud as first assistant physician when the latter organized the Psychoanalytic Polyclinic in Vienna the same year. By 1924, Dr. Reich was not only a teacher at the Psychoanalytic Institute, but also was breaking new ground in psychoanalytic research. There was no way that any young physician interested in psychoanalysis could have had a finer background or a more authoritative introduction to his chosen field. He was the protege of the master of psychoanalysis. To be professionally associated with Freud and a member of the great man's circle was a rare privilege. To the end of his days, Dr. Reich acknowledged freely Freud's greatness and emphasized that his own work, including the discovery of the orgone energy, was rooted in Freud's epochal discoveries. While working with Freud, psychoanalytic failures, the so-called negative therapeutic reaction, attracted Reich's early research efforts. He abandoned the traditional Freudian practice of sitting behind the patient and sat beside the patient instead. Facing each other, looking at each other, therapist and patient now had contact. In view of what we have illustrated earlier in this book concerning the I-beam or visual ray, the merits of this improvement in psychoanalytic technique will be obvious. Resistances by the patient were a well-known reaction in psychoanalysis at the time. These were handled in essence through the transference phenomena. In transference, the analyst becomes a substitute for the hated or traumatizing person in the patient's past. The patient's reactions were thus transferred from the actual person to the analyst. Dr. Reich modified this procedure from his new perspective facing the patient. In full contact with the eyes and the face of the patient, Dr. Reich detected and attacked the resistances as they appeared. He described the attitudes of the afflicted person on the couch to the patient. Reich told the patient how he was holding his face, changing his expression, or shifting his gaze or his body. Reich would adopt in caricature the patient's attitudes and expressions as a means of bringing home to the patient the external aspects of his resistances. In medical hypnosis nowadays, the therapeutic value In medical hypnosis nowadays, the therapeutic value of mimicry is well established. Reich was using this therapeutic device nearly 70 years ago. These procedures went against classical doctrine, and there was opposition to his methods in Vienna. Reich was nevertheless encouraged by results to persist with his research. The systematic, successive dissolution of resistances led in due course to the basic conflict upon which the patient's neurotic character structure had been erected. Dramatic changes became evident in the patient at this point. Dissolution of the resistances led to changes in the patient's character. He became capable of genuine transference, of laying the basic conflict on the analyst. These findings demonstrated that the transference hitherto sought so eagerly in psychoanalysis was in most instances not a genuine transference. Rather was it a subconscious stratagem of the patient to avoid unmasking the painful basic conflict. Reich called the new technique character analysis, and it is described in his book of the same name. This work is the cutoff point for Reich as far as his acceptance by formal psychoanalysis is concerned. Thereafter goes the official legend: the brilliant innovator became crazy. In the accounts of these findings in Reich's own books and in the general literature of orgonomy, the reader is struck by the needle sharpness of Reich's observational powers. He was only in his late 20s and early 30s when he pressed the frontiers of this new healing art forward. Most evident of all is his ability to look facts right in the face and tolerate them, especially the generally evaded facts of genitality. His wholesome childhood on the farm undoubtedly contributed to this ability. In a book directed to the UFO mystery, perhaps it may seem strange that we should find ourselves delving into the discoveries of Sigmund Freud. Let us never forget, however, that UFOs have brought out widespread irrationalism in highly educated men of science. These evasions bear an all too clear similarity to the reactions of psychoanalytic patients in diverting attention from painful basic conflicts. We must know why such people cannot face the UFO problem. We can trace the etiology of this mass evasion of the UFO problem to the neurotic mass character, of which scientists are the possessors, the same as lesser mortals. This is why we now digress into Freud. Freud's discoveries, as crucial to ufology as they are to the rest of modern life, which increasingly incorporates them into the art of raising children, with each generation the children are progressively less traumatized and rigidized in infancy and childhood. Generations are beginning to appear almost incomprehensible to most people born prior to the Second World War. Freud's study of the psychoneuroses, those with a psychic basis and psychic symptoms, forced him to conclude that these neuroses were rooted in sexual impulses and inhibited memories. Hypnotic techniques used by Freud early in his work brought such memories to waking consciousness. For reasons not recountable here, Freud dropped hypnosis and developed another method of exhuming the repressed material. He called this method psychoanalysis. Free association in psychoanalysis presses the buttons on the patient's memory bank and brings the repressed memories and experiences to the conscious level. The conscious mind then arbitrates on this material, and the neurosis is thus gradually dispersed. At least so the general theory and practice goes. Psychoanalysis has proved a valuable tool in assisting thousands of human beings, but for Freud personally it was the unleashing of a whirlwind. Psychoanalysis revealed the overwhelming role played in adult neurosis by infantile sexual conflicts, and the central significance of infantile sexuality to an emotionally disturbed humanity. Freud found that the unconscious emotional life of human beings is a boiling cauldron of sexuality and aggression. These findings were unequivocal. Sexual fantasies, impulses, wishes, and yearnings were inseparably interwoven with childhood memories and situations. Most of these situations and yearnings had never been fulfilled except in fantasy, and so Freud concluded that in suppression and inhibition of infantile sexuality lay the origin of the neuroses. These findings in themselves would have been sufficient to bring down on Freud the wild wrath of society, and especially of organized religion, but the steady yield of psychoanalytic research took him far beyond this point. Freud broadened the concept of sexuality to encompass regions from which even the most liberal churchman could only recoil in horror. What adult life classified as perversions or aberrations were threaded all through the childhood material. Areas of the body other than the sex organs proved to be centers of sexual sensation in the child, including the mouth, anus, breasts, and urethra, but not confined to these. Actions and situations, furthermore, with no perceivable outward relationship to sexuality, produced sexual stimulation and sensations. Examples would be watching fires, rural panoramas, fights, and various forms of exhibitionism. Stimulation gained in this way could produce ejaculation in the male and sometimes resembling orgasm in the female. By the adult's standards of Freud's day, and even by today's greatly loosened conceptions, these things were perversions and aberrations. Their presence in all children to a certain age meant that from an adult point of view, the child is, in Freud's word, polymorphously perverse. The natural sexual development of the child passed through three main stages, which were, according to Freud, and in evolutionary order, oral, anal, sadistic, and genital or phallic. Orderly and healthy passage through the phases is essential for the emergence of a healthy adult human being out of the child. Through his clinical research, Freud showed that disruption and interruption of this development was due mostly to interference by parents and teachers who applied the culturally accepted adult standards of sexual perversion to the evolving child. This interference entered the life of the child with crushing authority and enormous force. Or, of course, I guess other than that, it would obviously also be various forms of trauma. But the sexual life of the helpless infant became an unequal battle against endless no-nos. These encroachments aborted or obstructed normal development to full genitality. The more powerful encroachments blocked the child's development completely at the pregenital level. The child, and therefore the resulting adult, became, in modern general parlance, hung up. Hence the cleavage between biological impulses and cultural requirements. The mass production of sexual inhibition has been the consequence. Freud further conceived of the adult perversions as partial impulses, which combine to form the total sex energy of the adult. Freud called this total energy the libido. Strengthening of any one partial impulse weakened the others. Out of this, Freud developed the concept of sublimation, or the transfer of part of the libido from sexual to non-sexual objects and goals that were socially acceptable. Freud delineated the inevitable conflicts between sublimation and sexual satisfaction, and between free sexuality and cultural demands. For unmasking the terrible consequences of compulsive religion in the sexual traumatization of children, and therefore in the creation of the adult neurotic, Freud was calumnized by official religion. He had awakened the volcanic forces of irrationality and destructiveness that lurk beneath the social facade of man. Every man or woman who would help heal mankind in any decisive fashion has encountered these murderous reactions. Abrams, Steiner, and Drown are three we have met in this book thus far who were similarly assailed and vilified by the highly educated no less than the lowly ignorant. Freud's elucidation of the so-called Oedipus complex excited further hostility. International rage ripped at the brave founder of psychoanalysis. He demonstrated with the steady harvest of clinical evidence the sexual attachment between children and their parents, an attachment that on the child's part is initially unitary, being both tender and sensual. Suppression and crushing of the sensual element early in the child's life also suppresses the tender side of the child-parent sexual relationship. Only hatred, indifference, or enmity remain. Every psychiatrist's office is full of it. By splitting the emotional life between love and sensual desire, anti-sexual upbringing results in the celebrated polarity of eros and sexus. This tragic schism in the emotional life produces impotence with a loved mate, together with sexual desire for a partner without love. Prostitution is a typical social phenomenon, sustained by this splitting of the human emotions. Psychiatrists' offices are heavily patronized by persons whose happiness is convulsed by its effects. Civilized living provides examples of it in abundance. In the first quarter of the 20th century, psychoanalysis has pursued these general findings against a flood of opposition and abuse. Work continued nevertheless in the therapy of the neuroses and in the application of psychoanalytic findings to the understanding of cultural life in all its respects. Freud's basic findings on infantile sexuality were beginning to find effect in new methods of raising children, methods that would reduce adult encroachments on infantile genitality. Freud himself was convinced that a pathway would be found from psychology to biology, but he could not himself make the breakthrough. The dynamic figure of Wilhelm Reich, Freud's protege, now leaped upon the stage. Before his final curtain, he was to change the drama of mankind. His 1925 orgasm theory was the first step on that pathway from psychology to biology that Freud said would be found. In due time, that same orgasm theory and the extensive bioenergetic research based upon it would lead to accurate functional comprehension of spaceship propulsion, biological UFOs, typhoon and hurricane formation, control of the world's weather, and above all to the demonstrated need for society to secure the genital rights of infants and adolescents. Reich was the first scientist to claim these rights for the innocent young. All these achievements stand among 1,000 other compartmented mysteries of science and philosophy that can now be functionally connected and understood in a new way. The world has now largely accepted Freud. In some would-be super-modern quarters, he is considered an old-fashioned fud. Children in Western nations are increasingly raised on the bedrock of his basic findings. What Wilhelm Reich achieved rests on the same Freudian bedrock, and a century hence may well be recognized as the inevitable consequence of Freud's pioneering. Reich's systematic study of patients who were not helped by analysis or who later suffered a relapse revealed a common element. The persons under study had failed to develop a satisfactory sex life. Patients aided by analysis had, by contrast, achieved a satisfactory sex life. Reich turned his energies onto the elaboration of this finding. The idea of an energy was immanent in Freud's whole concept of the libido, and Reich discerned in the cases that gave a negative therapeutic reaction a stasis of libido, an energy stasis. What should move was stagnant. Sexual activity of the patient in and of itself did not conquer the stasis. Gratification in the sexual act was the key, and a patient lacking the capacity for such gratification could not achieve it by intensifying or expanding his sexual activities. Reich termed the capacity for complete sexual gratification orgastic potency, and was at pains to differentiate it sharply from mere erective potency. To this day, the conventional psychiatrists and lay people alike are befuddled on this issue of orgastic potency as a study of contemporary literature, both professional and general, certainly reveals. When the therapy led to orgastic potency, decisive changes took place in the individual under treatment. Wilhelm Reich was the first scientist to undertake the systematic study of the orgasm. This primal convulsion, lying at the roots of life, had never received any scientific attention other than in the most gross and transitory way. Science, in the time of Reich's early orgasm work, knew far more about explosives and how to blow human beings to bits than it knew about the human orgasm. Since the energy in the organism was discharged by this process, quite aside from the sexual substances, there could be little doubt of the central role played in human sexual health by the orgasm. Up to Reich's time, nobody had asked the question, what is the function of the orgasm? Years of painstaking experimental work, including systematic galvanic recordings of the changes in human skin potential during sexual excitation and intercourse, revealed an unequivocal 4-beat rhythm of tension, charge, discharge, and relaxation. Reich called this the orgasm formula. The waveform of this energy activity is the Kreiselwelle, or spinning wave. We have already met this waveform in Dr. Drown's instrument designs and in UFO functions. When Dr. Reich unlocked this central secret of bioenergetic activity, he gave psychoanalysis the most powerful forward thrust it had ever received. The libido up to this time had been regarded as an essentially psychic concept of sex energy, even though the workings of an energy were implicit in the concepts of blocking, splitting, and sublimation that Freud had formulated. Now there were galvanic tracings demonstrating energy activity in the human organism during sexual orgasm that followed a lawful but heretofore undetected pattern. Out of this discovery there arose quickly a much more massive challenge. The bioelectric tracings were galvanic, of the order of millivolts, thousandth parts of a volt, an electrical potential of 40 millivolts, 40 thousandths of a volt, would not even light the tiniest penlight. Energies involved in the orgastic convulsion were obviously vast, and yet the bioelectrical tracings were minuscule. The libido was demonstrably, via these tracings, a real energy. The tracings were minute indicators of a far more massive energy metabolism at work in the living human. Reich also found that discharge of the excess energy in a gratifying sexual act stabilized the energy level in the organism. This regulation of the whole energy household was the true function of the orgasm, rather than the mere hurling out of the sexual substances. Clinical experience verified that when patients were led by analysis to the establishment of orgastic potency as defined by Reich, their neuroses could not be maintained. With the dispersal of the neurosis in the individual came new social attitudes, including a new morality anchored within the personality. The renewed human being wishes sex only with one whom he loves. He perceives the irrationality of compulsive social mores, and finds it incomprehensible that millions of people are brainwashed into such behavioral codes. Pornography is distasteful, and sexual promiscuity is of no interest. Tolerance develops towards the sexually perverted. Dr. Reich termed this kind of sexually healthy individual self-regulating. Reich further found that the traumatizing incursions by the adult world upon infantile sexuality, all the don't touch it and no edicts imposed on the child, had definite physical effects on the infant's body that were carried into adulthood. The prohibitions and denials became somatically anchored in the musculature, even though repressed from conscious memory. Through the autonomic nervous system, chronic muscular contractions were set up by these adult invasions of the infant's genital rights. In their totality, these contractions became a permanent defense against giving or feeling on the part of the individual. The retracted pelvis, tightened buttocks, and clenched teeth were typical manifestations. Dr. Reich called these muscular contractions armor, a singularly appropriate name. Rigidity of thought and behavior were the external expressions of the armor. This was the somatic bedrock of the neurosis, and muscular rigidity precluded orgastic potency, the discharge of the excess energy of the libido. Reich eventually identified 7 armor rings in the human organism. These are the ocular, oral, cervical, thoracic, diaphragmatic, abdominal, and pelvic rings. One or more may be implicated in a neurosis. These chronically present contractions block the normal flow of the life energy through the organism to the genital, a specialized organ for the discharge and regulation of the energy. The eye block is of special significance in ufology, for nobody can see straight, optically and conceptually, with an armored eye segment. Human armoring is a universal phenomenon, and it influences significantly the way we perceive things, including UFOs pervaded with life. When repressed conflicts were resolved in analysis, the muscular armor dissolved and orgastic potency was established. The individual's body lost its rigidity, the face became more mobile, and the patient became able to give. A notable early finding of Dr. Reich in this connection was the terror manifested by every patient when the end phase of analysis was reached and the muscular armor dissolved. In a body conditioned to sexual stasis and blocked energy flow, movement of the released libido energy produced sensations of terror and a desire to clamp down. The same energy that Wilhelm Reich was dealing with in these discoveries is involved intimately in everything to do with UFOs. Orgone energy propels those UFOs that are craft, and orgone energy animates the critters. Orgone energy is involved with our eyesight and with the bringing of images into consciousness. Many of these manifestations of orgone energy occur in great strength. These manifestations bring about a corresponding movement of the bioenergy of every neurotic individual with access to them, that is, of mankind in the mass. Like the patient who cannot stand the motions of his own energy, we have seen in everything to do with UFOs irrational clamping down. Those who believed this clamping down was mere censorship will see that it has much deeper roots, and it is Reich alone who has led us to them. There is much more to Dr. Wilhelm Reich that we must deal with before we proceed to his involvement with UFOs as an investigating scientist. What we have thus far laid bare of his early work has rifled right into the social problem of UFOs, and to understanding why people have reacted irrationally to this latter-day phenomenon. As we proceed, Wilhelm Reich will truly appear as a man of the future, slaving to serve a century deaf, dumb, and blind to his genius and its fruits. So, from orgasm to UFOs, no unimportant man is hated and persecuted as Reich was. A.S. Neal. Dr. Wilhelm Reich's first book, The Function of the Orgasm, was published in 1927. Updated versions of this book are on the world market now. Function is Volume 1 of Reich's The Discovery of the Orgone, and it members this distinguished behavioral scientist into his time and into his age as a man with exceptional power to break new ground. Dr. Reich's unique personal unfoldment saw him gain an outstanding reputation in psychoanalysis at its world epicenter during the lifetime of Freud himself. That this same man was later to become personally and scientifically involved with the UFO problem, on a scale not even remotely approached by any other scientist, makes him worthy of the most careful study. Because so much of the UFO mystery involves pathological behavior of all kinds, every person with clear judgment will recognize the importance of the behavioral element to every investigator and thinker. The original investigations and findings of Reich in both biopsychiatric and biophysical fields are sharply germane to the UFO field in all its aspects. Orgasm and UFO are closer to each other than is realized by today's narrow-spectrum UFO investigators. Volume 2 of The Discovery of the Orgone, entitled The Cancer Biopathy, long out of print after the federal burnings but recently reprinted, describes, for example, a number of Reich's inventions that have application to UFO investigation and which are part of the new technology. These include the orgonoscope for visually detecting the orgone energy in the atmosphere, and the orgone field meter for measuring the extent of life fields around organisms. The orgone accumulator is also described together with its method of construction. Those who rush to relieve Reich's work of this store of seeming goodies, all ready and available for use, will not get very far with any effort to split off these devices from the whole body of thought that gave them birth. Every civilized human of reasonable intelligence who studies Volume 1 and 2 of The Discovery of the Orgone will find something in these pages much more important than Dr. Reich's inventions. He will find himself, or some part of himself, leaping out of the same pages. The UFO problem will begin to appear to all who can face what they find about themselves as a problem in human functioning, with the blockages to its solution lying within ourselves. This is why Dr. Reich's discoveries in human functioning are so crucial to the UFO field, and why such detailed attention is given to them here. Dr. Reich established in his pioneering work 3 major aspects of human functioning. 1. The energetic reality of the libido as an energy flowing in Kreiselwelle, or KRW waveform. And 2. The function of the orgasm in regulating the level of bodily energy. And 3. The muscular armor as the physical agency by which the natural flow of energy is blocked or impeded in the human organism. As part of the work that led to these findings, Dr. Reich originated the first substantial efforts to apply psychoanalytic knowledge to mass problems. He organized the workers' psychoanalytic clinics in Berlin for the Communist Party in the pre-Hitler period. His ideas and findings, which led in the long run to true individual freedom in the sense of self-regulation and responsibility for oneself, diverged from the Red Line, with red dogma being rooted neurotic compulsively in blocked genitality. As Reich showed in his book The Mass Psychology of Fascism, his separation from the Communist Party was inevitable. He was expelled in 1933. In The Mass Psychology of Fascism, recently reissued by Noonday Press of New York after being burned with his other writings, Dr. Reich delineates the mass character that stands behind fascist dictatorships. Basing his work on clinical observations of German workers, he accurately defined how individuals lacking the capacity for self-regulation would follow irrational leadership, right through the gates of death. In the Second World War, millions of such individuals perished, taking with them millions of innocents. A Hitler need do no more than mobilize and focus the colossal, otherwise blocked energies of the multitudes to shatter and realign all the relationships of Earth life. Hitler's advent in 1933 compelled Reich to leave Germany. Moving initially to Denmark, he was there squeezed again by Nazi pressure, crossed to Sweden and thence to Norway. His years of teaching and research at the University of Oslo's Institute of Psychology were among the most productive of his career. He was hot on the trail of the energy of the libido, the life energy, and made the breakthrough from psychology to biology and to biophysics during this time. Galvanic tracings proved that pleasure produced a small electrical charge at the skin surface, coincident with the expansion of the organism and proportionate to the pleasure. This charge disappeared in the presence of anxiety. These galvanic tracings proved to be a lawful, objective expression of basic biological functioning, and a further key to the function of the orgasm itself. A satisfactory sexual experience caused by this energy first to manifest at the skin surface, and then to discharge through orgasm. Anxiety precluded the appearance of the energy at the skin. Reich was thus empirically led to regard the genitals as a specialized skin organ capable of discharging energy and thereby regulating its level. These were new findings of tremendous import to all the life sciences. The theorizing, intellectualizing, and groping of formal psychoanalysis, together with the internecine struggles that raged between its leading figures in these years, were being left behind. Reich was plunging into biophysics. Each small finding raised further questions. Between the minuscule electrical charges at the skin surface and the immense energies at work in the orgasm, there was a contradiction. Such small energy changes could not possibly produce a convulsion on the whole human plasma system. The question forced itself again and again on Reich: what was this life energy and where did it come from? Conventional thinkers maintain that we get our energy from food. While this may be partially true, advocates of this explanation remain unable to impart movement to a corpse by stuffing it with food. There is something else involved with the animation of the living. Reich's attempt to find out where the life energy came from led him, by the obviousness of the food theory, to the study of the breakdown of food. Under sterile conditions with tight controls and using a microscope magnification of 2,000 to 3,000 times, disintegrating food was observed to produce tiny luminous blue-green globules that were motile and capable of culture. Dr. Reich called these pulsating energy vesicles BIONS. Emergence of these BIONS was systematically recorded on motion pictures, and every stage of the transformation was thereby objectified. Germs brought near BIONS were killed. Dr. Reich further found that anything that can be made to swell and break down, including sand, soil, and coal, will create BIONS. Objections naturally arose to all this because the non-living was appearing seemingly as the source of the living. Existing concepts of the origin of life were being opened to serious empirically backed questioning. Objections contained frequent references to so-called air germs as a contaminating source of the life forms emerging from disintegrating mineral and plant substances. Reich's controls were complete, but he heated his materials to incandescence and still the BIONS appeared. The work of British biochemist Morley Martin in resurrecting a veritable microscopic zoo from azoic rocks under conditions of total sterility and the similar resurrection of living forms from the Bavarian salt deposits have already been discussed. We have come upon Reich's BIONS with this preparation, with our concepts of life and death changed. The BIONS should therefore come as no surprise, although to this day they are formally ignored or verbalized away by neurotic mandarins of science, whose cosmo-conception has now been completely undermined. The BIONS were discovered originally by H. Charlton Bastian of France, a contemporary of Pasteur, and also something of a competitor of Pasteur's for the final scientific or formal scientific approval. Bastian wrote about his BIONS in a book called The Beginnings of Life, connecting his discovery with germs and diseased conditions. Official science preferred the mechanistic fixity of Pasteur's conceptions, where germs exist immutably and are killed by various agencies. Pasteur won immortality and Bastian went to oblivion, although 21st century science will undoubtedly set right this historical slight. What is important to establish here is that official science plumps away for the lifeless, the sterile, and the motionless. The same basic argument, air germs, adduced to deprecate Reich's discovery of the BIONS, has been adduced, reflections, ice crystals, to deprecate UFO sightings. The mechanism of evasion is the same in both cases, and by such illustrations, the investigator may become more aware not only of the reality of these evasions, but also of their origin, a whole world order threatened at its bedrock. Reich found that the BIONS degenerated into so-called T bacilli. T is an abbreviation for Tod, German for dead. When injected into mice, these T bacilli caused cancerous symptoms. Healthy BIONS were an antidote. The invention of the ORGONE accumulator later on proved that it was the energy charge of the BIONS that attacked the T bacilli. In this early work, however, the BIONS appeared less as energy carriers than as quasi-bacterial agents. A frightening experience befell Dr. Reich in the winter of 1939 when he was studying the BIONS. His eyes began to burn from looking into the microscope and he developed a chronic conjunctivitis. His skin also began to tan in the depth of the Norwegian winter. The bion cultures imparted strong charges, detectable within an electroscope, to nearby metallic objects. What force, what radiation, had he unlocked from these microscopic vesicles? The dangers and terrors attending the discovery of radium by the Curies in France came vaulting into Reich's mind. Protection would surely be found in shielding, he reasoned. Shielding was a logical technical step to take under conventional concepts of radiation. Dr. Reich expected by this means to be able to confine and control the energy from the bions. Building a metal-lined box, he was alarmed and astounded to find that this box intensified the radiation effects within its own periphery and produced inexplicable external effects in addition. A permanent temperature differential appeared above the top of the box, for example, which appeared to negate fundamental thermodynamics. This attempt to shield bion energy actually led to the discovery of the ORGONE energy accumulator, a six-sided box consisting of alternate layers, from the inside out, of metal and insulating material. The ORGONE accumulator provided a simple means of concentrating the energy directly from the atmosphere. This development came later when Dr. Reich could review and begin to unravel the skein of new findings originating with his bion discovery. As an unsuccessful effort to shield bion energy, however, the six-sided box initially produced chagrin and confusion. The energy was intensified in its manifestations by the box. Furthermore, the energy appeared to be everywhere and in everything. No defense could be contrived. No adverse effects occurred, however, and slowly Reich's apprehensions subsided. Realization seeped into him that the energy was universally present, and that the bions had simply brought this energy into focus and to human attention by local intensification. Dr. Reich identified this energy with the galvanic energies present at the skin surface. Later on in America, 1939 through 40, he discovered the presence of the energy in the atmosphere as a primordial, mass-free energy. He found this same energy as also present in blood that was allowed to disintegrate. The connection to the single spot of dried blood held in a blotting paper as a tuning crystal in Dr. Drown's work will automatically commend itself to the reader at this point. The two titans, unbeknown to each other, were treading parallel paths. The presence of the ORGONE energy in disintegrated blood verifies from yet another angle the access given to the life energy continuum by the much ridiculed single spot of blood. Dr. Reich called this energy ORGONE to identify it permanently with things organic, with the orgasm and with life. He proved its existence visually, thermically, electroscopically, and later on at the Geiger-Müller counter and by illumination in Vacuum tubes. He was able to develop protozoa from the bions. This led him into cancer research, impelled by the prevision that cancer might have a similar origin. Dr. Reich subsequently demonstrated that the etiology of cancer lies in sexual repression. Suffocation of the tissues and their subsequent putrefaction is due, according to Dr. Reich, to the armoring process, set afoot in infancy and culturally sustained. The cancer scourge is the consequence raised to new heights in the 20th century by multitudinous environmental factors, including junk foods, nutritional ignorance, and carcinogenic agents, reaching humanity via many routes. While a review of the cancer problem lies beyond this book, worth recording here is Dr. Ruth Drown's view of cancer. She held that it originated in the inability of the life energy to freely and fully penetrate the muscular systems of the human body. Dr. Steiner, in his medical lectures, similarly characterizes cancer as a disease of frustration. Dr. Reich's bion work, despite its transcendental importance to the life sciences, provoked the hostility of group of psychiatrists of the University of Oslo. Unable to contend on a rational scientific basis with the objective evidence that Dr. Reich was accumulating, these little men hit below the belt. They instigated a slanderous campaign against him in the Norwegian press. A university education and qualification in psychiatry are not guarantees against irrationality today, and they were not in Norway in 1939. Dr. Reich's prior experience with destructive irrationalism on the social scene led him to ignore these attacks completely and to concentrate on his research and its bounty of new discoveries. Newspapers are not a suitable forum for either presenting or defending scientific findings. Amid these storms, America beckoned. Dr. Reich was invited to lecture at the New School for Social Research in New York City. He accepted, and his American odyssey began as Europe disappeared under the clouds of a fearful new war. In the USA, Dr. Reich quickly found his feet and continued his pursuit of the life energy. He invented the orgonoscope for detecting the energy visually in the atmosphere, and the orgone field meter for measuring the extent of orgone energy fields. The confusing early effects of the six-sided box with which he had sought to shield the bion energy were consolidated into a major scientific discovery as the orgone energy accumulator. He provided decisively that the accumulator produced a temperature differential out of nothing. This spectacle of a cold body warming up a hot one shakes the whole foundation of thermodynamics, since it contracts the second law of thermodynamics, one of the granite plinths of mechanistic science. The implication of the second law of thermodynamics in its widest sense is that the entire universe is running down. Energy is being distributed through space randomly, and the process is increasing, and ultimately there will be nothing but random radiation where once there was matter. The orgone accumulator demonstrates that this principle is empirically incorrect in certain specific arrangements of materials. Since no prior exception has been found to the second law, no one will believe that the law is wrong, although it is a statistical law and expresses only the most probable behavior. Reich's original discovery of the orgone accumulator is only a beginning. Subsequent workers seem to have concentrated on replicating Reich's findings with the orgone accumulator, but also seem to lack direct contact with the energy. Any reasonably sensitive person who will build and play with orgone accumulators free of preconceptions will find this effect of heating appearing out of nothing to appear in all sorts of ways, all of them destructive of the second law of thermodynamics. In working with Dr. Reich's cloudbuster invention and many derivatives and variants of such apparatus over 30 years, I can attest to the numerous magnetic and thermic anomalies created by their operation. These effects literally thrust themselves at a perceptive operator. By chance, just through participating instead of arguing, I found that when an orgone accumulator is suspended over flowing water, its underside develops warmth. There appears to be no reason why such a differential could not be amplified to furnace levels by experimenting with both water flow and layering variations in orgone accumulator construction. As with so much else of Dr. Reich's, the problem is not data or hardware, but the threat these fundamental biophysical discoveries pose to the products of our modern-day parrot education. As his work in the U.S. proceeded and became ever more fruitful along bioenergetic lines, Dr. Reich saw the emotions as manifestations of a specific biological energy, blocked and impeded to produce various types of character problems. He developed techniques for freeing the orgone energy from these blocks by direct means, rather than via the roundabout psychoanalytic route. These techniques are known today as medical orgone therapy. Dr. Reich trained many students and physicians in his methods for physically freeing the muscular armor, as well as in character analysis. Medical orgone therapists were required to repeat his laboratory experiments through which the orgone energy was discovered. This careful and thorough regimen included doing Dr. Reich's experiment 20, which proves that protoplasmic matter can develop from concentrated free orgone energy in the accumulator.
From the resulting plasmatic BIONS matter, protozoa may develop. Medical orgone therapy also sometimes includes the use of man-sized versions of the orgone accumulator. When used therapeutically in this way, the basic six-sided box with a metal lining is increased to a volume sufficient to accommodate a human being. One side is hinged to make a door so that the patient may enter, sit on a small bench, and after closing the door, irradiate his organism with the concentrated orgone energy that the accumulator produces. Here again one must do, and the doubts then take care of themselves. The simple layered construction of the orgone energy accumulator, like the simple construction of the drown instrument, have led to automatic conclusions on the part of complex-minded physicists that no such device can have any value. These people fail to perceive the corresponding simplicity of the voltaic cell or of the simply layered carbon and uranium in an atomic pile. The layered structure of the electric eel, which also produces a lethal voltage out of nothing, similarly eludes their biased gaze. The only way to evaluate the orgone accumulator is to sit in it for extended periods, making full use of one's God-given vision. After an hour in the accumulator, when your eyes have become completely attuned to this new environment, you will see luminous particles come spinning out of the walls. Their trajectory is unmistakably that of the spinning wave, or KRW. As you watch those spinning particles, you will become aware that an identical trajectory is traced by every planet as it spins around the sun. The same trajectory is traced by the typhoon as it barrels across the western Pacific and curls northeastward before dissipating. You will think on these things, and also on the singularly cogent fact that the same waveform expressed in the orgasms of your parents produced you. You in turn reproduce your kind by the same energy moving in the same way. Whatever is rational in you will then ask what is possible for them who forged these mighty cosmic links for humanity for the man who forged these mighty cosmic links for humanity to die in a federal prison. You will begin to wonder what forces of malignant savagery inspire the smashing by government agents of such accumulators as were built by Dr. Reich, devices that demonstrate directly to you and the cosmic expanse pulsate together. You will also now be able to synthesize into all this the propulsion systems of the ubiquitous disks in the skies. With their spinning organotic fields around them, they too trace KRW forms in the ethers as they flit across our skies. Any theory that can bind together the origins of physical life, the weather of the world, the orbital patterns described by the planets, the human orgasm, and the flying disks, can hardly be an accident or a coincidence, but rather the yield from organic, unrelenting study of objective facts and processes. Dr. Reich naturally expected that his contributions to a new physics, rationally replacing the old physics in due and orderly course, would be acknowledged by his contemporaries. In December of 1940, he wrote to Albert Einstein and asked for an appointment to discuss his findings with the great man. Professor Einstein agreed to see him and received Dr. Reich on 13 January 1941, an interview for which Dr. Reich had carefully prepared himself. The two men spent almost 5 hours together, an indicator of Einstein's interest in Reich's findings, since the former was busy with matters leading to the atomic bomb. Professor Einstein was willing to further investigate Reich's discoveries. With the lights out in Einstein's study, the great mathematician had seen the scintillations of the orgone energy through the orgonoscope. When Dr. Reich told him about the temperature differential above the orgone accumulator, Einstein said that if true, it would be a bomb in physics. Reich left the orgonoscope with Einstein, and the latter agreed to check the temperature differential above an orgone accumulator that Reich would build for him. 2 weeks later, Dr. Reich delivered the small orgone accumulator in person to Einstein's home in Princeton. Placing the accumulator on a table in the cellar, 2 thermometers were used to establish the temperature differential. One thermometer was placed in a tube above the accumulator. The other was suspended a yard away in the free cellar air. Professor Einstein, within a few minutes, confirmed the presence of the thermic differential. Reversing the 2 thermometers, the differential was again produced. Professor Einstein was intrigued by the differential he had himself read directly from the thermometers. He asked Dr. Reich if he could keep the ORGONE accumulator for additional studies, promising to write him within a few weeks concerning his findings. Reich agreed, and the 2 men parted in mutual goodwill. On 7th of February 1941, Professor Einstein wrote to Dr. Reich providing an explanation for the temperature differential that had been adduced by an unnamed assistant. Einstein's conclusion was that the anonymous aide's explanation of the thermal differential was satisfactory. By implication, the ORGONE accumulator did not work as Dr. Reich had claimed. This scene by mail almost exactly acts out in the real world and with real people the kindred events dramatized in Steiner's mystery plays. Strader, the inventor of devices of a new character and utilizing a new natural force, is impugned by an Ahrimanic know-it-all who could easily have been Einstein's assistant on this occasion. Everything of Strader's is explained in this same evasive fashion. Everything concerning UFOs since the Second World War has been similarly verbalized away by similarly inspired scientific know-it-alls. Dr. Reich, like Strader in the mystery plays, was able to completely rebut the spurious explanation by the anonymous know-it-all, but it mattered not. Silence descended on the relationship from which Dr. Reich had expected so much. Months later, Einstein returned the ORGONE accumulator and, after some prodding, the orgonoscope. There was no further commerce between the 2 men, to Reich's intense disappointment. Once more, the ORGONE energy had provoked the irrational in a distinguished man of science. 2 years later, Alamogordo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki showed where Professor Einstein's head was, alas, for poor mankind. The ORGONE accumulator continues to produce heat out of nothing. In a man-sized accumulator, you can feel the orgone coming off the walls with your hands. Your body gets warm and tingly as you sit in the box. Stay in it long enough and your skin will get red all over your body. There is no doubt about this once you expose yourself to the phenomena. Reich found that cancer mice kept in an ORGONE accumulator outlived healthy mice that were kept under normal conditions. Burns were dramatically aided by the ORGONE accumulator, which affected prompt elimination of pain or its significant reduction, and promoted rapid healing. Human cancer cases did not develop anemia, and many remarkable results were achieved in the reduction of tumors. Dr. Reich spelled out the story of his clinical work with cancer in the ORGONE accumulator, successes and failures alike, in both the cancer biopathy and in articles in the ORGONE Energy Bulletin. In 1947, Dr. Reich identified the emotional plague of mankind, abbreviated EP, a disease of bioenergetic equilibrium that exists in the mass character by virtue of its well-nigh universal presence in individuals. Social irrationalism and destructiveness are its main characteristics. The emotional plague is rooted in unsatisfied orgastic longings and in the general corruption of sexual health by socially entrenched irrationalism and time-honored but life-negative institutions. The emotional plague has manifested prolifically in UFO affairs since the earliest modern advent of the UFO phenomenon. Suppression of information, ridicule of investigators, obstruction and subversion of rational work by governments themselves, riddled with and addled by corruption, exemplify the emotional plague on the UFO scene. Any investigator who gets on the true tale of the UFOs through their bioenergetic roots and spiritual connections will feel the full force of the emotional plague. His telephone and his mail will be monitored. If he has evidence, his files will probably be rifled by government burglars. While Dr. Reich was doing his giant's work, so vital to the human future, He was pilloried in 1947 by Mildred Eddy Brady, a woman writer who had no factual knowledge of his work. Here again was the emotional plague. Dr. Ruth Drown was similarly assailed throughout her life by ignorant writers. Brady immortalized herself in a negative way by inferring that in a New Republic article that Dr. Wilhelm Reich was a sex racketeer. Dr. Reich had devoted over a quarter of a century to the scientific investigation of sexuality from the Freudian bedrock, as outlined in this book. He had published his findings. He had made monumental contributions to the therapy of the neuroses. He had opened the way to the only rational cure to what ails humanity, prevention of sexual crippling in babyhood, infancy, and adolescence. Pornography had been shown to have its roots in the secondary perverse drives that develop from the blocking of the primary natural drives. He had contributed more to accurate scientific knowledge of human sexual functioning and all its ramified socio-economic implications than any living man, or any man living. Yet it was implied that by Brady that he was operating a pornographic racket. Brady's article captured the interest of the Food and Drug Administration, which at its lower levels employs hoodlum-type personnel who have always been allowed far too much latitude by their superiors. These cretins came to Dr. Reich seeking the pornographic literature they felt sure he must be disseminating. Scientific information on the orgone energy accumulator and orgone energy research was of no interest to the FDA men. In the absence of any evidence whatever of pornographic works, or against the orgone accumulator, the government investigation retreated behind the scenes. With Dr. Reich being clean, honest, and upright, there was no other place for the functionaries of darkness to go but behind the scenes, there to prepare a lavish ambush. The FDA was, from this time forward, out to destroy Wilhelm Reich, undoubtedly inspired and encouraged by big medicine. The FDA eventually used against him the identical legal stratagem employed in its suit against Dr. Ruth Drown, the interstate shipping laws. There is no little significance in the FDA electing to pursue this course after its 1951 success against Dr. Drown, which smeared her and crippled her work. The orgone accumulator offered them a chance to employ again the mislabeling provisions of the interstate shipping laws. The precedent had been established. There is no space here to review the enormously complex and emotional nature of Dr. Reich's trial. The ordeal imposed on a private citizen by having to fight the government with all its resources is an overwhelming event in itself. The nature of Reich's work and his heavy involvement with the UFO problem made his ordeal all the more horrendous. While every city in the United States crawled with gangsters, thugs, embezzlers, thieves, and crooked politicians, the government felt its proper target was an internationally renowned man of science. Only the emotional plague can rationalize and legally sanctify such monstrous irrationality. The FDA complaint charged that Dr. Reich had entered devices into interstate commerce that were misbranded under the food and drug laws. The FDA view was that if Dr. Reich sent accumulators to licensed physicians in other states, so that clinical information and evidence could be gathered, or if he otherwise leased or rented them for use under a physician's supervision in another state, this constituted shipping. The FDA said in effect that there was no orgone energy and that therefore the devices were misbranded. In yet another echo of the Drown case, the FDA wanted all orgone accumulators destroyed, all of Dr. Reich's 10 major books banned, and all scientific literature not in cloth-bound form burned. A vast experimental record in bulletin and journal form would thus be consigned to the fire. The USA, to its own immortal shame, carried on in the tradition of history's book burners. Dr. Reich was also to be banned from disseminating in any way to anyone information regarding orgone accumulators and kindred apparatus. This provision would legally restrain him from taking the orgonoscope or accumulator to a Professor Einstein or any other man of science. These strictures were similar in scope to those sought from the judge in the 1951 Drown case by the federal prosecutor, and all this happened in America. In a written response to the FDA charge, Dr. Reich asked that the matter be taken out of court completely because he held that courts were not empowered to arbitrate or regulate basic natural scientific research. The judge maintained the court had jurisdiction and a legal treadmill was set in motion that eventually led to Dr. Reich's being sent to a federal penitentiary. He was legally outmaneuvered by the government, whose prosecutor was Dr. Reich's own former Foundation attorney, one Peter Mills. Here again the Drown case echoes. In the second assault on the Drown work, the judge assigned to her case as a man at a lower legal station and in a 1951 fit of frustration had publicly sworn to get her. This judge had to be removed from the bench in her second trial, a sickly, unchivalrous spectacle. Dr. Reich's actions in and reactions to these convulsive legal matters will never be understood aright without considering what he went through with the UFOs, or the manner in which the UFOs impinged upon his life and work. Glib judgment has been plenteous on the Reich trial and on his allegedly deteriorated behavior. We will gain a better perspective of all of it if we proceed with a review of his later technical and scientific discoveries. Dr. Reich discovered the motor force in orgone energy and successfully ran an orgone energy motor in 1948. A group of specialists known to me plans the rebuilding of the orgone motor with a view to the permanent conquest of the fuel and energy problem. The power principle of the motor was the excitation of an orgone energy accumulator by a half-volt of electricity, and the combination ran a 25-volt motor. Qualified individuals known to me personally saw the motor running many times. The device was essentially a biomechanical reproduction in reverse of the situation that exists with the millivolt galvanic charges appearing at the human skin from a primary bioenergetic power source sufficient to propel and convulse a 200-pound human being. From a half-volt input, 500 millivolts, Reich could run a 25-volt motor with the power developed by the orgone accumulator or transduced by the accumulator from the primary energy continuum. Here is the beginning of a new type of propulsion, obviously stemming from and applicable to space. So also it is it the writing on the wall for fossil fuels, energy monopolies, the manipulation of people by greedy sheikhs or amoral American oil barons, and the pollution of the earth. Dr. Reich had developed an essentially fuelless motor. Starting the motor initially involved what Dr. Reich called the Y factor, something he never disclosed. Dr. Rudolf Steiner dramatized the forthcoming advent of this motor force in his mystery plays 40 years earlier. Strader, the inventor in Steiner's prescient dramas, could in many ways have been the foreshadower of Wilhelm Reich. Dr. Steiner's spiritual scientific conceptions give access to hidden qualities of tone unsuspected by official science, and studies of this material as well as practical experience with the cloudbuster would indicate that starting the orgone motor involved a specific movement of the human form. An etheric shock effect can be produced in this way, capable of energizing the entire assemblage. Thereafter it moves unaided and indefinitely. In 1948, Dr. Reich also produced illumination of concentrated orgone energy in a Vacker tube. This experiment had far-reaching implications in the gestating space age. 20 years later, the Apollo moon missions were giving unwitting proof of this illumination discovery. The illumination of the energy in a vacuum proved that the orgone energy could exist in space. As has been mentioned in earlier chapters, the astronauts walking on the moon showed blue illumination around themselves, as they excited their personal orgone energy fields with their voice-powered radio transmitters in the vacuum of the moon's surface. All this unwitting proof of the value and prescience of Reich's work passed over the heads of NASA physicists. The spurious nature of the blue luminescence around the moonwalkers outside their spacesuits that were supposed to combine them completely made the problem all the more difficult for those without understanding of the orgone energy and its characteristics. U.S. government agencies had burned the experimental data on illuminating orgone energy in vacuo 10 years previously. Research into orgone energy functions repeatedly led to the conclusion that an antagonistic relationship existed between orgone energy, which is pre-material in the atmosphere, and electromagnetic energy, which is post-material. The illumination experiments further demonstrated the ability of electrical energy to excite orgone energy. Dr. Reich decided late in 1949 to investigate further the relationship between orgone energy and electromagnetic energy in the form of atomic radiation. On January 5, 1951, Dr. Reich put 1 milligram, just 1,000th of a gram of radium, sheathed in its lead container, into a 20-fold orgone accumulator, i.e. an accumulator made up of 20 layerings of metal and insulating material. The package was then placed inside an orgone room, which is a metal-lined room with plywood or other insulating material adjoining the metal on all sides. Reich then left the package in the orgone room for 5 hours. He repeated the process daily for a week. On the last day, he left the radium and 20-fold orgone accumulator in the orgone room for only half an hour. Conventional physics would opine that nothing could possibly happen under known laws of nuclear physics. What actually did happen blew away the foundations of that lethal and uncertain science. The story of this event is written up fully in Dr. Reich's booklet, The Oranier Experiment, first report 1947-51, since burned by the Food and Drug Administration. Sufficient it here to quote a brief description of what occurred by a participant eyewitness, the late Dr. Ellsworth F. Baker. A distinguished author and psychiatrist, Dr. Baker remained meticulously loyal to Dr. Reich and his work until his own passing. In his final years, Dr. Baker wrought the miracle of orgonomy's resurrection after the debacle of Wilhelm Reich's death in prison. Here's what he says of this dramatic period. "I know what happened, I was there. The count on the Geiger counter went up alarmingly and finally jammed. The building and the atmosphere around it glowed at night. One physician went into shock and nearly lost her life when she put her head in a metal cabinet in the laboratory. The mice died and a peculiar, sickening, acrid odor pervaded the atmosphere, while clouds hung over the area constantly. Reich fell ill and hovered between life and death for weeks. The whole area became uninhabitable. Although the radium was finally removed to a place 11 miles away, the process did not let up. I am confident that one day science will discover that this type of reaction accounts for the radioactive layer above our atmosphere, the Van Allen belt, due to cosmic rays meeting the Earth's energy envelope." In the wake of this shocking, tumultuous experience, UFOs began to appear around Orgonon, Reich's 260-acre estate in Maine. Today there is little doubt among those familiar with UFOs and with orgonomy that Dr. Reich had heavily disturbed a fundamental interface of nature. By concentrating both the primary mass-free energy of space and the secondary post-material energy of radioactivity together, he had signified that sleeping mankind was waking up to the cosmos. He had aroused the interest of certain entities riding in spaceships. That they were what we now know as the boys from downstairs also seems beyond doubt. Before long, Reich was locked in a new kind of cosmic struggle, one that few people could have comprehended prior to the writing of this book. The young, brave, supernally brilliant scientist, who had taken the first intelligent look ever at the human orgasm, was now in the evening of his life to do battle with UFOs on desperately unequal terms. The entities he had to deal with were advanced masters of the orgone energy he had discovered. When he defended himself in the grim days that followed, he was defending his discoveries and his life's work. His opponents were out to push him and all his works right off the earth.
Alright, so since The Magical Revival and Aleister Crowley and the Hidden God are in searchable format PDF, I thought I'd look up where he mentions Wilhelm Reich, since he mentions him in The Magical Revival and Aleister Crowley and the Hidden God, and not much more elsewhere. Although the Ninth Arch has many points where I think his stuff's implied, especially verse 398, because even though it's blank, That's the number of orgone, and there's just different reasons why I think that. But anyway, in 1939, Wilhelm Reich discovered a radiating energy in BIONS derived from sand. They were later found to be present in the soil, the atmosphere, solar radiation, and the living organism. And so that's all he mentions right there, but he's talking about alchemy and the Tantras. And there's increasing talk about the Kalas and these energy specters and whatnot, scintillations. So Crowley knew that the crux of tantric ritual lay in its connection with the magically induced ecstasies of sexual orgasm. Orgasm, in Reich's sense of a fulfillment paroxysm involving the entire organism, is sometimes set against the tantric concept of A, a total orgasm, or B, a total absence of orgasm. Both these interpretations have been read into the tantric texts. In either case, orgasm is commonly regarded as psychophysical phenomena, but this is incorrect. Reich emphasized the distinction between ejaculation and orgasm, the one being physical, the other being, strictly speaking, metaphysical. Ejaculation without orgasm is a common occurrence, and, as Reich pointed out, total orgasm is a far less frequent phenomenon. It is undoubtedly even less frequent than he supposed. The tantric conception of orgasm in its directly sexual sense, for it has others, is of a more comprehensive order. It may, in fact, be described as parasexual. It involves the Kundalini Shakti, of which the sexual aspect is its most material form. The actual production of semen is the end product, if not the waste product, left over from an improperly and incompletely absorbed current of consciousness. And he says the consciousness current is twofold, magical and mystical. The former operates in the lower chakras, the latter in the higher. That which ejaculates as semen is unabsorbed energy, prana or ojas, and it always contributes to the creation of material forms, whether lodged in a womb or not. If not, the overflow, as in masturbation, sodomy, fellatio, etc., is taken up by the astral and qliphothic entities and built into organisms already existing upon the subtle planes. Paracelsus refers to homunculi, or artificially generated creatures, made from sperm independent of the female organism, and to astral larvae and parasitic monsters built out of the substance of voluptuous imaginings. And so again, orgone and orgasm, and then the kundalini, so the function, or the, what did he call it, the method, I guess, of the orgasm is similar to the winding up, in a sense, and then release of the kundalini. Although you can't say like every time you have an orgasm is kundalini. It's just more so the condensation and combustion. But let's see if there's any other references. So he quotes the Book of the Law. Whatsoever may be the goal of man as conceived by Reich and others, for the tantrics the goal is attained by a reversal of the process which leads to the substantiation of the power generated during orgasm. So in Tantric Buddhism, for instance, the bodhicitta, the light of consciousness, is not permitted to formulate itself as semen. The process is entirely mystical, and when women feature in the rituals, they are used to stimulate the kundalini, to awaken it from sleep in the lowest center, before it begins its ascent. The notorious Kala circle of the Vamacharins, or Tantrics of the left-hand path, in some of its divisions utilizes the female for similar purposes, but she remains virgin. So again, there's a lot to just the theory behind a lot of this, I guess, going back really far. So he quotes Bion, the vesicles representing transitional stages between non-living and living substances. And going back to Bions of orgone, which is a weird thing I found just was like, I wonder what BIONS equals. BIONS of ORGONE. But going back to the whole thing about Ruth drown in blood and the living nature of the blood, sarx, I forgot how it's actually pronounced in Greek, but flesh and blood in Greek is 444. And then so is Oedipus, the Oedipus complex, or just Oedipus in Greek. So Freud's whole, or Trevor Constable's claim that Freud wanted to create a link to biology, well, neurology is 444, and then the Oedipus and just all this sort of energetic connection. It's kind of interesting. It's also vider lider, or from generation to generation. Agros, the field or the garden. Oh yeah, Sparima, the Greek coiled serpent. So, in the Oedipus. Sarx kai ima, flesh and blood. In this whole thing about, dim and DM in Hebrew is blood, and then keshap, or keshef, is magic, so blood magic is 444. And magic being, or blood, being essentially the DNA link, which makes like voodoo and whatnot active. Also chi, or chai in full, cheth yod he, which is the life force in full, 444. So that's kind of weird. And I knew like he doesn't mention Wilhelm Reich much, but I wanted to mention that Kalas, which is a time, a period, essence, emanation, ray, star, etc. Kamakala, desire, ray. And Kaula, distinct from Kala, is more of like the tradition, and the Kula means clan. So there's a footnote. Wilhelm Reich demonstrated under laboratory conditions the precise nature of this process of tiring with its inevitable toxic effects. See Discovery of the Orgone, The Function of the Orgasm, Volume 1. And here it says, so he says, the artist, the occultist, the scientist were among those who refused to conform to priestly superstitions. Even today, these sections of society are regarded with suspicion, if not with animosity, as a danger to society. People sensed in the artist, the magician, the alchemist, some undefinable yet potent quality that was inimical to their comfortable vegetative existence. The danger lingers on. The scientist, Wilhelm Reich, was eliminated by American authorities because the logical conclusions of his discoveries implied the total overthrow of society as it is known today. Yet it is upon the debris of that society alone that the kingdom of Ra-Hor-Kuit may be established and Liber AL.III put into practice. The keen and persistent practice of the Lima by even a few dedicated individuals will effectually overthrow society and thereby facilitate the unhindered development of the new eon and the reintegration of human consciousness. And so, again, he doesn't mention Reich very much more than that, even though, obviously, it's because his influence, symbolically and literally, I guess. Let's see, there's no index for this, but here he says Kalas, or as time or periodic measurement, also essence, ray, perfume, star, flower, symbolic of Kali, the supreme flower, or periodic emanator of worlds. There are 32 major Kalas in the cosmos, represented by the 32 paths of the Tree of Life, which contain the cosmic power zones and the 16 Kalas emanated by the human organism, 8 in the male and 8 in the female. The Kalas of varying hue have given their name to the colors, and their periodic manifestation to the calendars, concepts and words of everyday thought and speech. But the main Kala, or color, is Kali, which means black, our word kohl, also kohl, a substance used by women to darken their eyelids. Black has reference to the mysteries of sex and death, and the reason for the hitherto unexplained statement, Osiris is a black god. Set, or soot, also means the black or burnt one, in so-called black magic, derived originally from cognate ideas which predated the white magic of the solar cults. So again, Kamakala, the ray or essence of desire. For the tantric conception of the evolution and play of this ray or kala, see the Kamakala Vilasa of Sri Punyananda Natha, translated by Sir John Woodruff. So, let's see. Night Side of Eden, I'm pretty sure references kalas. I think every one of them does. So, essences, principles, elements, flowers, perfumes, fragrances, medicines, metals, colors. The word has all these connotations and many more. In the Tantras, the kalas are divisions of time, and have a very special connotation, being connected with the doctrine of the vaginal vibrations or effluvia of the female used in the sacred rites. These are represented in the Kabbalah and the Tarot by magical glyphs, which it is the purpose of my books to explain. Kala Chakra, the wheel or chakra that distills the supreme or Mahakala, sometimes called the Chandra Kala or moon medicine. And Kali, the black goddess of time, our word calendar derives from her name. She is black because time dissolves phenomenal existence back into non-manifestation. So Wilhelm Reich comes on page 109, 110, and 217. So there's nothing in the macrocosm that does not have its reflection in the microcosm and vice versa. Wilhelm Reich maintained that fear of imminent catastrophe so prevalent in our age is generated by a morbid apprehension of imminent internal disintegration due to dammed up vegetative energy. Hence the massive nature of the neuroses, psychoses, and similar disorders characteristic of the present day. On the other hand, if Reich is right and the inner stresses are building up so enormously, a compensating explosion is bound to occur in the outer. So, whichever way the phenomenon is interpreted, the result is, in either case, will be catastrophic in the external world. So down here, a number of bion, which according to Wilhelm Reich are vesicles representing transitional stages between non-living and living substances. And the definitions. Kalas, time, essence, ray, division, digit, a term used in the Tantras to denote the essence or fragrance of the Suvasini. In its sense of time, our word calendar derives from kala. In its sense of essence or vibration, our word color. Hence, the flowers of the goddess are her kalas. The China rose or blood-red hibiscus is the symbol of Kali, whose kalas manifest as the colors in the alchemical process of transmutation and in the distillation of the elixir of life, or vinam sabati. So Reich isn't mentioned in Hecate's fountain, but let's see. Here, kalas are time, also a digit of the moon as marker of the bright and dark fortnights. Our word calendar derives from kala. There are 16 kalas, or lunar fluids, known to terrestrial science, and they are situated in the organism of the human female. Hence, Kali as goddess of time and of kalas. Time is the source of energy that powers spacecrafts. When converted into energy, the kalas appear as the power that motivates spacecraft and enables them to travel infinite distances in the twinkling of an eye. Kala Chakra, this circle or power zone of time, the Mongolian rite of the Kala Chakra involves the 16 terrestrial sub-elements or kalas. See Crowley's comments in Atu 7 in the Book of Thoth. Here he just has Kali and Kala circle, Hindu goddess of time and period. She gave her name to the calendar and to the kalas that make up the periods of time, marked off by her physical almanac. Kali is regarded as a goddess of destruction or dissolution because time dissolves in the undifferentiated ocean of noumenal consciousness the variety of phenomena. In Kaula circle, the magical circle of the goddess Kali in the form of a flower or lotus, typical of the feminine emblem of source and of the gateway of ultimate dissolution. The fullest blossoming of the lotus, or circle, is attended by 43 Suvasinis. Its mysteries have been expounded in cults of the shadow. The moon circle is a cognate glyph. 73, 136, and 138. Or no, 77. 77, 136, and 138. So the cast-off orgasm reflexes, which says UFOs were seen to appear like, was an expression coined by Wilhelm Reich to describe a quite different phenomenon. In an interview with Dr. Ronald Lang, the question was raised of a possible contradiction between the findings of Wilhelm Reich and the tantric conception of the orgasm. The question concerns us here because it reflects a popular misunderstanding of tantric praxis. The orgasm, in Reich's sense of a fulminant paroxysm involving the entire organism, is set against the tantric concepts of A, continuing, and B, a total absence of orgasm. Both interpretations have been read into tantric texts, which naturally lead to confusion among non-initiates because the orgasm is regarded sometimes as a physical and sometimes as a metaphysical phenomenon. Reich insisted on the distinction between ejaculation and orgasm, the one physical, the other psychological. He pointed out that ejaculation without orgasm is a common occurrence, whereas the total orgasm is a far less frequent phenomenon. The tantric conception of orgasm, in its directly sexual sense, is of a far more comprehensive order. It may, in fact, be described as parasexual. It involves the fire snake, of which the sexual aspect is its grossest form. The production of semen is an end product, indeed a waste product, a leakage from an ineptly circularized current of consciousness which is twofold, magical and mystical. The former functions in the 4 lower chakras, the latter in the 2 higher, Vishuddha and Anya. So semen is therefore unabsorbed energy, or ojas, and it invariably contributes to the generation of material forms, whether lodged in a womb or in a subtle matrix. So essentially what he said in the Magical Revival. An orgasm may be induced at any one of the 6 centers, or at all of them simultaneously, in which case the metaphysical chakra is brought into play. This is the Sahasrara chakra, represented on ancient Marma maps as an event act coming into existence just above the region of the cranial suture. It is the higher 1,000-petaled lotus, synonymous with the fully flowering Sri chakra. And further, so whatever may be the goal of man as conceived by Reich and the psychologists, for the tantrics it is attained by a reversal of the usual process of substantiating or manifesting energy produced during orgasm. In other words, the tantric aims to reverse the current of materialization until it merges with its source in the cosmic ocean of preconceptual energy. And here he puts kalas as the Uttara kalas, the 17th kala is the first of the cosmic, Uttara meaning beyond, kalas, or kalas from the outside. The tantric Kali, the tantric goddess of time, a name from which derived the words calendar, and Kol, Kali means literally black. Kalki, a name of the coming Buddha, Maitreya, an oriental form of Ma'at, and Kamakala. Kaula, the word comprises Kala and Kula. The Kaulas are tantric adepts who practice Sri Vidya, a form of oriental alchemy, the science of extracting the 16th Kala, that part, or Kala, where time stands still. And Kala circle, based upon the circle of the Sri chakra, comprises 43 or 44 participants, thus equating it with the 43 or 44 angled yantra of the Sri chakra. Kula, part or section. In Vamamarg, Kula denotes the 16th part. See Kala and Kaula. And then the 9th arch. I don't think Reich is mentioned specifically in here, but like I said, post 398 and a few others make me think of him. Yeah, he's not, but... So, Kala, time, essence, perfume, secretion, digit of the moon, etc.
a black stone, or tektite, the black goddess of time, Kali, hence the destroyer of all manifestation, Kalika, a form of Kali as the primordial or ancient goddess. Note that in many ancient languages, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, etc., the letter Ka, or K, is the 11th letter. It represents the goddess whose presence as Shakti distinguishes magic from magic. Kaula, the word combines Kula, Shiva, and Kala, Shakti. The term designates a sect of tantric adepts of the Vama Marg. Kaula Circle, see Beyond the Mod Zone, chapters 3, 4, and 5. And so he goes through all these different forms of magic, essentially, different traditions, recensions, some of their similarities, differences. But the reason I brought up Kalas is because essentially, being time, they diffuse themselves in a sense, like any energy would. And I don't know, just the orgone energy being void in a sense, or clear, preconceptual. There's a lot to that, I think, and it's too difficult to really talk about. So 398 being the void, really at the heart of the sigil of Eosic, implies the egg. This, in the previous verse, may imply that the sigil of Eosic is the nest, or silba, containing the egg in which the new knowledge gestates. Number 19, Chava, to manifest, show forth, or Eve, really, is the feminine glyph. The number 21 includes the path of Kaf. In verse 22 is void, 0 or O, the egg, and the oracle is 398, Cheth Pe Shin Yod, meaning book. It was in the cryptic candlestick that the grimoire of the Grants was discovered. The grimoire sought by Aleister Crowley, Phineas Black, and other occultists, which held extra-dimensional keys that unlocked the tunnels of Typhon and the cells of Set. This book Akbish is a part of the grimoire insofar as it enabled Arim and Eosic to locate its source.